Tonight, we're diving into the fascinating world of tariffs, the taxes on trade that have shaped economies, politics, and global relations for thousands of years. From ancient Mesopotamia to modern trade wars, we'll explore how tariffs work and why they matter to all of us. Before you drift off to sleep, please hit that subscribe button so tomorrow you'll find more fascinating stories and intriguing knowledge to gently carry you into dreamland. Sweet dreams, and thanks for listening. Tariffs are one of the oldest tools in the toolbox of economic policy, as ancient as trade itself. Though the term may seem like a product of modern geopolitics or late-night cable news debates, its roots stretch back thousands of years, embedded in the evolution of human commerce, sovereignty, and power. At its core, a tariff is a tax imposed by a government on goods and services imported from other countries. It functions not unlike a toll paid at a highway booth, except in this case, the gatekeeper is a nation-state, and the road is a global sea lane, railway, or fiber optic line. Tariffs operate on a simple mechanism. When a product crosses a border, the importing country's customs agency assesses a charge, either a percentage of the item's value or a flat rate per unit. This tax can serve multiple functions. It can raise revenue for the government. It can make foreign goods more expensive to protect domestic industries. And it can be used as leverage in trade negotiations, a geopolitical bargaining chip wielded with precision or bluster. But the essence remains. Tariffs alter the terms of trade, shifting costs and influencing behavior. The story of tariffs begins in the distant past, in the cradle of civilization itself. Archaeological evidence and cuneiform tablets suggest that as early as 3000 BCE, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia levied taxes on goods transporting along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Clay tablets found in the ruins of Ur and Lagash record inventories and tallies that point to the existence of commercial tariffs, particularly on grain, textiles, and livestock. These early states understood what governments throughout history have since reaffirmed. Controlling and taxing trade routes is a direct pathway to power. By the time of the Roman Empire, tariffs had grown into an institutionalized system. Rome's portoria were customs duties levied at city gates, seaports, and border crossings across the empire. These were not trivial fees. Portoria could comprise a significant portion of the imperial treasury. Private tax collectors, known as publicani, bid for the right to collect these duties, and their role was both lucrative and often controversial. The uniformity of Rome's legal system allowed for more standardized tariff regimes across provinces, yet the burdens could be unevenly distributed, reflecting Rome's broader imperial logic, one of extraction and control. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and the landscape becomes even more fragmented. As feudalism took hold, tariffs turned hyperlocal. Tolls were imposed by barons and bishops, cities and kings. A merchant moving goods from Milan to Paris could encounter dozens of such barriers, each demanding its own payment. These tolls served both fiscal and defensive purposes, with revenues funding fortifications, armies, and the lavish lifestyles of the aristocracy. But they also created a patchwork of economic inefficiency that would later prompt reformers to advocate for freer trade. The modern concept of tariffs began to take shape in the mercantilist era of the 16th to 18th centuries. As emerging nation-states jockeyed for colonial power and wealth, tariffs were embraced not merely as revenue tools, but as weapons in an economic arms race. The logic was zero-sum. One nation's gain was another's loss. By imposing tariffs on foreign goods and subsidizing domestic production, mercantilist governments hoped to achieve favorable trade balances and hoard precious metals. In this period, economic policy was indistinguishable from grand strategy. The state, the market, and the battlefield were intertwined. Yet even as tariffs became a central feature of national economic policy, their purposes evolved. In the United States, for example, tariffs were the primary source of federal revenue in the 18th and early 19th centuries. There was no income tax. Instead, customs houses at ports like Boston, New York, and Charleston collected duties on imported goods. The famous Tariff of 1789 was one of the first major acts of the new American Congress. It aimed to both raise revenue and protect the nascent American manufacturing sector from British competition. The dual purpose, fiscal and protectionist, would remain a defining characteristic of tariff policy across time and nations. As industrialization spread in the 19th century, tariffs became flashpoints of political ideology and economic philosophy. Protectionist measures were often championed by industrializing powers seeking to shield their growing industries from foreign competition. Meanwhile, free trade advocates, drawing inspiration from classical economists like Adam Smith, argued that tariffs distorted markets and harmed consumers. In the British Empire, the famous repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 marked a decisive turn toward free trade, one driven by the needs of an urbanizing population and the moral imperatives of the Anti-Corn Law League. Still, tariffs persisted. Their strategic utility was too great, their appeal to domestic industries too powerful. Even in periods dominated by liberal trade rhetoric, governments maintained the right to impose tariffs when expedient. The late 19th century saw a resurgence of protectionism in places like Germany and the United States, where economic nationalism blended with industrial ambition. The 20th century transformed tariffs yet again. After the disasters of the Great Depression and World War II, the global community sought to limit the use of unilateral trade barriers. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, established in 1947, was a watershed moment. It aimed to create a rules-based system where tariffs could be negotiated and reduced multilaterally. For decades, rounds of GATT negotiations chipped away at global tariff levels, culminating in the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. But the death of tariffs was greatly exaggerated. Even as average tariff rates declined in the developed world, new forms of protectionism emerged: non-tariff barriers, subsidies, quotas, and technical standards. And in the 21st century, tariffs have returned to the headlines with renewed force. Trade wars, geopolitical tensions, and climate imperatives have given rise to a new generation of duties: carbon border adjustments, digital service taxes, retaliatory tariffs in bilateral disputes. The story of tariffs is, in a sense, the story of how nations relate to one another in the material world. It is a tale of sovereignty and interdependence, of competition and compromise. Tariffs reflect the eternal balancing act between openness and control, between the allure of global markets and the imperatives of national interest. They have been reviled as tools of economic coercion and celebrated as instruments of industrial policy. They are ancient, yet perennially modern. As we continue this journey through the history and complexity of tariffs, we will encounter thinkers who challenged them, leaders who wielded them, and societies shaped by their consequences. From Mesopotamian scribes to modern trade negotiators, the tariff has left its mark on civilization. It remains, in all its forms, one of the most potent and controversial levers of economic power ever devised. Tariffs may appear to be simple taxes on goods crossing borders, but beneath the surface, they branch into a complex taxonomy. Like tools in a craftsman's kit, each tariff type serves a different function, shaped by the goals of policymakers and the contours of the goods in question. Understanding these variations is essential to grasp how trade policy is formulated, manipulated, and experienced across global markets. At the heart of this complexity lie the basic classifications: ad valorem, specific, and compound tariffs. An ad valorem tariff is perhaps the most straightforward and widely used type. Its Latin name means according to value, and that's precisely how it works. The tariff is assessed as a percentage of the goods' declared value. For instance, a 10% ad valorem tariff on imported shoes worth $100 would result in a $10 duty. The elegance of this model lies in its proportionality. The tax scales with the price of the item, making it easier to implement across diverse product categories. It's also favored for its alignment with inflation and shifting market values, although it relies heavily on accurate customs valuation, which in practice is often a battleground of paperwork, negotiations, and occasional deception. In contrast, a specific tariff imposes a fixed fee per physical unit, regardless of the item's value. A country might charge $0, $50 for every kilogram of imported sugar, or $100 for every imported washing machine. This approach provides predictability and stability for customs officials, and it's especially useful when value fluctuations would otherwise disrupt tariff revenue. However, it can also lead to disparities. For example, a high-end luxury appliance and a basic model would incur the same tariff under a specific system, creating regressive effects where cheaper goods face a proportionally heavier tax burden. To bridge the strengths of both approaches, governments often employ compound tariffs, which combine elements of both ad valorem and specific charges. For example, a tariff on imported tires might include a flat $2 per unit plus 5% of the value. Compound tariffs offer a more tailored strategy, allowing governments to maintain a baseline level of revenue while also responding to shifts in market pricing. They are particularly common in agricultural products, textiles, and automobiles, sectors with intricate pricing dynamics and politically sensitive domestic stakeholders. Sometimes the categorization is not just about method, but also intent. Tariffs are often described as fiscal or protective in their purpose. A fiscal tariff is designed to generate revenue for the government. These are particularly significant for developing countries, where customs duties can comprise a major share of public income in lieu of efficient internal tax systems. Many early modern states relied on fiscal tariffs as their primary source of funding, long before the rise of income and corporate taxes. On the other hand, a protective tariff is explicitly designed to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. These are deployed to discourage imports, giving local producers an artificial advantage in their own markets. Logic is straightforward. By raising the price of foreign goods through tariffs, local alternatives become more competitive, even if they are more expensive or less efficient. But while the intent may be to nurture homegrown industries, protective tariffs often lead to trade tensions and sometimes retaliatory measures from affected countries. Beyond these core types, the evolving nature of the global economy has given rise to hybrid and innovative tariffs, targeting emerging sectors and cross-border challenges. Among the most discussed in recent years are carbon border taxes, which aim to address the carbon leakage problem. Countries with strict environmental regulations fear that companies will relocate production to nations with laxer rules, undermining both climate goals and local economies. A carbon border adjustment would impose tariffs on imports based on their carbon content, leveling the playing field and incentivizing cleaner production methods worldwide. The European Union has taken the lead on this front, announcing plans for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, that could reshape international trade patterns over the next decade. Then there are digital service tariffs, another novel development in the 21st century trade landscape. These are levied on companies that provide digital services across borders. Think global streaming platforms, online marketplaces, and cloud service providers. As commerce increasingly migrates to the digital realm, traditional trade policy frameworks have struggled to keep up. Countries like France, India, and the UK have implemented digital service taxes targeting large US-based tech firms, prompting backlash and threats of retaliatory tariffs from the United States. Though not tariffs in the classical sense, these duties function similarly by imposing costs on cross-border transactions, reflecting how modern trade no longer fits neatly into shipping containers and customs declarations. We also encounter seasonal tariffs, which vary throughout the year depending on supply and demand dynamics. These are often used in agricultural sectors, where domestic harvests need protection during specific months. A country may lower tariffs on foreign strawberries in winter when local production is dormant, but raise them in spring to protect domestic farmers during the harvest. This temporal flexibility can stabilize local markets, but also adds layers of complexity for exporters navigating foreign policies. And there are anti-dumping tariffs, technically classified as countervailing duties. These are imposed when a country believes that foreign producers are selling goods below fair market value, often below their own production costs, in order to gain market share and cripple local competitors. The World Trade Organization permits such tariffs under strict rules, but the process for proving dumping is often contentious, entangled in political motives as much as economic evidence. Anti-dumping duties are particularly common in steel, chemicals, and consumer electronics. The same goes for safeguard tariffs, emergency measures that allow a country to temporarily raise tariffs to protect a specific industry from a sudden surge in imports. These measures are meant to buy time for adaptation, not serve as long-term protection. However, in practice, they're often extended under political pressure. Such was the case with the U.S. steel safeguards imposed in the early 2000s and revisited in 2018. They triggered international legal battles and retaliatory tariffs, highlighting how even temporary measures can unleash permanent consequences. Another classification worth noting is preferential tariffs, which reflect international diplomacy rather than domestic protection. These are reduced or zero tariffs offered to specific countries as part of trade agreements or development initiatives. The Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, for instance, allows developing countries to export goods to wealthy nations at lower tariffs, promoting economic development and fostering political goodwill. But preferential treatment can also create tensions. Countries excluded from such deals may see them as distortions of the market and lobby for inclusion or protest through the WTO. Lastly, there are retaliatory tariffs, which are explicitly political tools. When one country imposes duties that another deems unfair or illegal, the response may be reciprocal tariffs aimed at exerting pressure or forcing concessions. Retaliatory tariffs are central to modern trade conflicts, including the US-China trade war, which saw billions of dollars worth of goods subject to escalating rounds of duties. These measures are less about protecting specific industries and more about projecting power and negotiating from a position of strength. All of these types, standard or innovative, protective or preferential, reveal the versatility of tariffs as economic instruments. They are not merely fiscal tools, but reflections of national priorities, geopolitical strategies, and evolving technological realities. Whether used to balance trade, promote sustainability, or regulate digital empires, tariffs continue to adapt, mutate, and multiply in response to the global environment. As we dig deeper into the ideological roots and theoretical justifications of trade policy, it becomes clear that tariffs are not just numbers in a ledger. They are the front lines of competing visions about how economies should function, how nations should interact, and who ultimately bears the cost of globalization. To truly understand tariffs and the controversy surrounding them, we must explore the intellectual scaffolding that has supported or challenged them over the centuries. Economic theories about trade have evolved dramatically, from intuitive notions of barter to mathematically rigorous models. At the core of this evolution lies one central question: should nations protect their economies from foreign competition, or should they embrace open trade and the efficiencies it brings? The debate begins with Adam Smith, the Scottish moral philosopher whose 1776 masterwork, The Wealth of Nations, is often credited as the founding text of classical economics. Smith argued forcefully against protectionism, challenging the mercantilist dogma that had dominated Europe for centuries. At a time when nations obsessed over maintaining trade surpluses and hoarding gold, Smith proposed a radical alternative: the idea of absolute advantage. In simple terms, absolute advantage suggests that if a country can produce a good more efficiently, using fewer resources than another country, then it should specialize in that good and trade for others. Each nation should do what it does best. Smith's vision was clear: trade is not a zero-sum game. It creates mutual gains, allowing all participants to benefit by exchanging surpluses for their needs. Tariffs, in this view, were artificial distortions, barriers to the natural efficiency of markets. Smith's ideas laid the foundation, but it was David Ricardo, a British financier and economist writing in the early 19th century, who took the argument to a higher level of abstraction. In 1817, Ricardo introduced the concept of comparative advantage, a theory that would become one of the most enduring principles in economics. Ricardo observed that even if one nation is less efficient than another in producing everything, trade can still be mutually beneficial. The key insight is opportunity cost. Suppose England is better at producing both wine and cloth than Portugal. Even so, if England is relatively better at making cloth than wine, and Portugal is relatively better at producing wine, then each should specialize accordingly and trade. England trades cloth for wine, Portugal does the reverse. Both nations end up with more of both goods than if they tried to produce everything domestically. Tariffs, in Ricardo's framework, interrupt this delicate balance of specialization. They introduce inefficiencies, reduce total welfare, and hinder the full realization of global productivity. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Ricardo's comparative advantage dominated mainstream economic thought. It underpinned the liberal trade agenda of empires and emerging industrial powers alike. But as the global economy became more complex, especially with the rise of capital and labor mobility, economists sought more nuanced explanations. Enter the Hexarolin model, developed in the early 20th century by Swedish economists Eli Heckscher and his student Bertil Ohlin. This model introduced a critical refinement. Trade patterns are shaped not only by productivity differences, but by factor endowments, that is, the relative abundance of labor, capital, and land. Countries export goods that use their abundant factors intensively and import goods that require scarce resources. For example, a country with abundant capital but scarce labor will specialize in capital-intensive goods, while a labor-rich country will focus on labor-intensive goods. This model helped explain why, for instance, the United States, rich in capital and land, exported machinery and wheat, while importing clothing and textiles from labor-abundant nations. The Hexarolin model also introduced political implications. If trade benefits the owners of abundant factors and harms the owners of scarce ones, then domestic opposition to free trade becomes understandable. In a capital-rich country, capitalists gain from trade, while workers might lose ground to lower-wage competition abroad. Thus, the model anticipates the tension between global economic theory and national political reality, where the costs and benefits of trade are distributed unequally. Still, the Hexarolin model had its limitations. It struggled to explain why countries with similar factor endowments, such as the United States and Western Europe, traded so extensively with each other, and it did not account for the dynamic role of economies of scale, branding, or technological innovation. This led to the emergence of new trade theory, pioneered in the late 1970s and early 1980s by economists like Paul Krugman, who would later win the Nobel Prize. New trade theory broke with the classical assumption of perfect competition and constant returns to scale. Instead, it recognized that in many industries, particularly those involving complex manufacturing or technology, firms experience increasing returns to scale. In other words, the more they produce, the cheaper their average costs become. Under these conditions, countries can gain a competitive edge simply by being the first to establish large-scale production. This insight helps explain why a handful of nations dominate industries like automobiles, aerospace, and pharmaceuticals. It's not just about natural resources or comparative advantage. It's about strategic market positioning. New trade theory also explains why nations with similar economies still trade heavily. Consumers demand variety. Americans buy German cars not because they can't make cars, but because they want Volkswagens and BMWs. Germans, in turn, may want Fords and Teslas. Trade becomes not only a matter of cost efficiency, but of product differentiation and consumer preference. What does all this mean for tariffs? The answer is complex. In the Ricardian world, tariffs are always bad. They reduce efficiency and harm consumers. In the Hexarolin framework, they can be defended if trade hurts domestic workers, especially in developing or labor-scarce economies. And in the world of new trade theory, there's room for strategic tariffs, carefully targeted measures that might help a country establish a foothold in an industry characterized by high fixed costs and network effects. This leads to yet another theoretical development: strategic trade theory, an offshoot of new trade theory developed in the 1980s. It suggests that in industries with significant barriers to entry and global-scale advantages, such as aviation, semiconductors, or green technology, government intervention, including temporary tariffs and subsidies, can help domestic firms gain a competitive advantage. If done correctly, this can lead to long-term national benefits, even if it violates the free market ideal. However, strategic trade theory is a double-edged sword. If every nation pursues this approach, it can lead to a destructive cycle of tit-for-tat protectionism. The theory also assumes a high level of state competence in picking winners, an assumption history often contradicts. Still, its influence can be seen in modern industrial policies across the globe, from South Korea's Kibol system to China's Made in China 2025 initiative and the recent resurgence of U.S. industrial policy. What these varied theories share is a recognition that trade policy is never purely economic. It is also social, political, and strategic. Tariffs are not just about supply and demand. They reflect a nation's priorities, its values, and its position in the world. Whether they are condemned as distortions or defended as necessary tools, tariffs sit at the intersection of theory and practice, idealism and realism. As we turn next to the arguments in favor of protectionism, we will see how these theories are invoked, bent, and sometimes ignored in the service of national policy. Because in the real world, economic logic must always contend with political power, and the tug-of-war between theory and reality is nowhere more evident than in the story of tariffs. The word protectionism often carries a certain baggage, sometimes invoked as a warning, other times as a badge of pride. At its heart, protectionism is the act of shielding a nation's domestic industries from foreign competition through tariffs, quotas, subsidies, or regulatory barriers. Economists have long debated the merits and downsides of such policies, and while many argue for the efficiency and mutual benefit of open markets, there is a rich and enduring history of arguments in favor of protection. These arguments are not always economically orthodox, but they are politically powerful, historically rooted, and often emotionally resonant. Perhaps the most enduring and intellectually respectable of these is the infant industry argument. This idea gained prominence in the early 19th century, largely thanks to Friedrich List, a German economist who sharply criticized the free trade doctrines of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Writing in 1841, List argued that nations, particularly those that were industrializing, needed time and protection to develop competitive industries. Exposing fledgling manufacturers to full-blown competition with established giants, he warned, would crush them before they could grow strong enough to stand on their own. List drew a parallel with agriculture. You wouldn't expect a sapling to survive a storm if it's planted in open ground without shelter. Similarly, a young nation might need temporary tariffs to shield its industries until they achieved economies of scale and technological maturity. This argument resonated deeply across the world, especially in countries like the United States, Germany, and later Japan and South Korea, all of which employed protectionist policies at key stages in their development. Even today, echoes of List's thinking can be found in the industrial strategies of emerging economies and in debates over reshoring industries in the developed world. Closely related to the infant industry defense is the national security argument. This one transcends economics entirely, dipping into the realm of sovereignty and state survival. The idea is simple. Some industries are too important to be left to foreign suppliers, no matter how efficient they are. The classic examples include defense, energy, and food. If a country becomes too dependent on imports in these sectors, it risks being strategically vulnerable, particularly in times of conflict, crisis, or geopolitical tension. The pandemic provided a visceral example. As global supply chains seized up, even the most open economies scrambled to secure essential items, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, by any means necessary. Suddenly, the idea that global efficiency should override domestic capacity didn't seem quite so compelling. The same holds true for rare earth minerals, satellites, or even agricultural inputs. The national security lens doesn't ask whether tariffs are efficient, it asks whether they're essential for independence. Another argument in favor of protectionism is the anti-dumping rationale, which focuses on unfair trade practices. Dumping occurs when a foreign producer sells goods in another country at prices below their cost of production or below prices charged at home. This tactic can be used to undercut local producers, drive them out of the market, and then raise prices once the competition has collapsed. In theory, anti-dumping tariffs are supposed to level the playing field, ensuring that competition is fair, not predatory. But proving dumping is difficult, and the process is often as political as it is economic. Countries file complaints to the World Trade Organization or conduct domestic investigations, sometimes lasting years. These measures are especially common in sectors like steel, chemicals, and textiles, industries where global overcapacity and state subsidies in one country can ripple out into global price wars. Anti-dumping duties are often temporary, but their impact can be long-lasting, and they serve a dual purpose: protecting jobs and sending a geopolitical message. And then there's strategic trade theory, a more modern and nuanced justification for selective protectionism. As we discussed earlier, this approach is grounded in new trade theory and argues that in certain high-tech or capital-intensive industries, government intervention can actually help domestic firms establish dominance. These are sectors with increasing returns to scale and first-mover advantages, where getting in early and growing fast can produce long-term benefits not just for the firm, but for the national economy. Semiconductors, aerospace, and renewable energy are prime examples. Governments might impose tariffs, offer subsidies, or establish public-private partnerships to cultivate national champions. The goal is not just to shield these firms from foreign competition, but to help them leapfrog into global leadership. While controversial and prone to failure if the government picks the wrong winners, this approach has delivered results in East Asia, most notably in South Korea's transformation from an agrarian economy to a high-tech powerhouse within 2 generations. Protectionist policies are also sometimes justified on employment and social grounds. Advocates argue that certain industries are so critical to regional economies or working-class livelihoods that their collapse would trigger long-term economic and social damage. Tariffs in this context become a form of economic triage, used to slow decline and give workers time to retrain or communities time to adapt. But these arguments often stretch into political economy, where protection becomes less about strategy and more about political survival. Politicians respond to voter pressure, lobbying by domestic firms, and regional employment crises. It's no coincidence that industries with strong unions or concentrated economic footprints, like steel, autos, and agriculture, are frequent beneficiaries of protective measures. Tariffs, in this view, are not just economic tools, they're electoral tools, used to signal allegiance to voters or shore up support in swing states. These pressures can lead to policies that are economically suboptimal but politically inevitable. For example, the United States has long imposed tariffs on imported sugar, raising prices for consumers but protecting a small number of domestic producers. The justification is framed around food security and tradition, but the persistence of the policy is better explained by lobbying and the peculiar mathematics of American politics. In the global South, protectionist arguments often intersect with post-colonial narratives. Developing countries argue that free trade benefits the industrialized world disproportionately. They point to histories of exploitation, the continuing dominance of Western firms, and the structural inequalities baked into global trade rules. For these nations, protectionism is not a deviation from economic rationality. It is a form of economic self-determination. This perspective was particularly strong during the 1950s to 1970s, when many newly independent countries adopted import substitution industrialization (ISI) strategies. The idea was to reduce dependency on foreign goods by building domestic industries behind high tariff walls. The results were mixed. Some countries saw growth and diversification, while others fell into inefficiency, corruption, and stagnation. But the impulse to control one's own economic destiny remains strong, especially in an era of mounting global inequality. Yet, for all its arguments, protectionism is not without risk. Critics warn of retaliation, where one country's tariffs provoke others to respond in kind, sparking trade wars that leave everyone worse off. They point to consumer harm, where tariffs raise prices and reduce choices. They highlight resource misallocation, where protected industries become bloated, inefficient, and innovation-averse. And they stress the danger of entrenchment, where temporary protections become permanent crutches. Even the infant industry argument has its pitfalls. While it assumes industries will become competitive over time, this often fails to materialize. Without pressure to improve, firms may become complacent, lobbying for continued protection rather than investing in productivity or innovation. In the worst cases, protectionism can entrench elites, deepen corruption, and disconnect economies from global advances. Nevertheless, the emotional and strategic appeal of protectionism endures. It speaks to a primal instinct, to preserve, defend, and control. It offers a sense of agency in an increasingly complex and interdependent world. Whether cast in the language of national security, economic justice, or developmental fairness, the case for tariffs and trade barriers continues to command attention, even in an age of unprecedented global interconnection. The next layer of the story lies in how these arguments get translated into actual policy, and how that policy gets shaped not just by theory, but by the messy, political machinery of democracy, lobbying, and power. Because in the real world, Trade policy is often forged not in think tanks, but in the backrooms of legislatures, the corridors of industry, and the voting booths of restless electorates. When we peel back the elegant layers of economic theory and the high-minded arguments for or against protectionism, we find a more chaotic, more human engine at work behind trade policy, politics. Tariffs are not just designed in ivory towers or academic seminars. They are forged in parliaments, lobbied for in boardrooms, and traded like commodities themselves in backroom political deals. The political economy of tariffs reveals how interests, power, and persuasion shape what countries tax, what they protect, and whom they benefit. At the center of this machinery is a phenomenon economists call rent-seeking. Unlike profit-seeking, which involves producing goods or services that people voluntarily pay for, rent-seeking is about capturing wealth by manipulating policy rather than creating value. When a company lobbies the government for tariffs to shield it from competitors, it is essentially asking for a special privilege, one that will raise prices for consumers and guarantee higher profits without improving the quality or efficiency of its products. Rent-seeking is especially potent in industries that are capital-intensive, regionally concentrated, or politically symbolic. Take, for example, the American steel industry. For decades, it has sought and often received protection from foreign competition, despite the fact that U.S. steel manufacturers are in many cases less efficient than some of their international counterparts. The industry's argument is usually framed in terms of national security or saving jobs, but underneath that is a powerful lobby with deep ties to legislators and unions, particularly in swing states like Pennsylvania and Ohio. This connection between economic interest and political influence is amplified by lobbying dynamics. Industries that stand to gain a lot from tariffs are more likely to invest heavily in lobbying than the diffuse population of consumers who would each pay a few extra dollars for goods. This creates what political scientists call a concentrated benefits, diffuse costs problem. A single steel company might spend millions lobbying Congress to impose tariffs that protect its market, while millions of consumers, each paying a slightly higher price for a car or refrigerator, don't organize in response. The result is an asymmetry. The policy is shaped by those with the most to gain, not necessarily by what's in the broader public interest. Lobbying, of course, is not new. One of the most notorious cases of political maneuvering around tariffs occurred in the United States during the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 has become a symbol of protectionism gone awry. Sponsored by Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis Hawley, the act raised U.S. tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to historically high levels. The goal, ostensibly, was to protect American farmers and manufacturers during a time of economic collapse. But what happened behind the scenes was a masterclass in congressional logrolling, a legislative process where lawmakers trade votes for mutual benefit. In the case of Smoot-Hawley, representatives from agricultural states agreed to support tariffs on industrial goods if their colleagues would support tariffs on farm products, and vice versa. Each legislator secured protection for their own constituents, resulting in a bill so packed with special interest provisions that it became a tangled web of economic self-interest. The result was catastrophic. Other countries retaliated with tariffs of their own, global trade collapsed, and the Great Depression deepened. Smoot-Hawley remains a cautionary tale, not just because of its economic consequences, but because of what it revealed about the susceptibility of trade policy to political manipulation. The act didn't emerge from a unified economic vision. It was built piece by piece, vote by vote, like a political Frankenstein. And though today's trade deals are often negotiated in more sophisticated ways, the basic incentives, pandering to domestic constituencies, rewarding campaign donors, protecting strategic sectors, remain very much alive. Even outside the legislative process, voter psychology plays a powerful role in shaping trade policy. People tend to feel the pain of job losses or factory closures more acutely than they notice the benefits of lower prices or wider product selection. This psychological asymmetry leads to what economists call loss aversion. People are more likely to rally against the negative effects of imports than they are to support the positive effects of free trade. Politicians understand this dynamic instinctively. Campaigns often feature imagery of shuttered factories, American flags, and working-class families hurt by unfair foreign competition. Tariffs in this context become symbols not just of economic protection, but of national pride, identity, and resistance to globalization. Even when the economic data suggests that trade has benefited the overall economy, these stories of displacement carry weight at the ballot box. One of the most vivid illustrations of this dynamic came during the 2016 and 2020 U.S. presidential elections. Trade was no longer a niche policy topic. It became a populist rallying cry. Candidates framed tariffs not as technical instruments, but as tools of economic justice. Voters in industrial heartlands, disillusioned by decades of job losses and wage stagnation, responded. This wasn't just about economics. It was about who the system worked for and who it left behind. The paradox here is that while the majority of economists oppose tariffs, seeing them as distortive and inefficient, majorities of voters often support them, particularly in times of uncertainty. That dissonance creates a fertile ground for political entrepreneurs, leaders who defy the consensus, champion protectionism, and promise to bring jobs back. It also creates tension in multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization, which promote rules-based trade but must contend with the domestic politics of sovereign nations. Tariffs can also become tools of geopolitical leverage. Governments use them to punish rivals, reward allies, or signal dissatisfaction. In recent years, trade policy has been increasingly weaponized, not just to manage markets, but to exert influence. For example, tariffs imposed by the US on Chinese goods in the late 2010s were not just about trade deficits. They were part of a broader strategic rivalry over technology, intellectual property, and global influence. In that context, the tariff was not just an economic instrument, it was a diplomatic message. In some countries, the political economy of tariffs is shaped not by democracy, but by state capitalism or authoritarian control. In China, for instance, trade and industrial policy are guided by long-term national strategies like Made in China 2025 or the Belt and Road Initiative. Tariffs and subsidies are deployed not in response to voter pressure or lobbying, but as part of a coordinated state vision. This contrasts sharply with the more fragmented, interest-driven models seen in Western democracies. Even within democratic systems, regionalism complicates trade politics. In large, diverse nations, different regions have different economic profiles and thus different interests. An auto worker in Detroit might favor tariffs on imported cars, while a tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley might oppose restrictions on global supply chains. This internal heterogeneity makes it hard to design trade policies that satisfy everyone. As a result, trade becomes part of a broader negotiation about national identity, economic priorities, and social values. And then there is the time horizon problem. Politicians operate on short election cycles. They seek policies that deliver visible benefits quickly. But the costs of protectionism, higher prices, retaliation, reduced innovation, often appear slowly, sometimes years later. Meanwhile, the benefits of liberalization, like greater efficiency and global integration, take time to materialize. This mismatch between short-term political incentives and long-term economic outcomes distorts policymaking. In sum, the political economy of tariffs reveals a fundamental truth. Trade policy is not just about efficiency, growth, or theory. It is about power, interest, identity, and strategy. Whether driven by lobbying, electoral pressure, strategic calculation, or ideological conviction, the decision to impose or remove a tariff is rarely a technocratic one. It is a political act, shaped by who has influence, who tells the most compelling story, and who stands to gain or lose. As we journey further back into history, we'll explore how these dynamics played out in ancient societies, where tariffs took different forms, served different purposes, and were enforced in ways that foreshadowed the complexities of today. Because while the names change and the economies grow more complex, the basic human impulses, security, self-interest, pride, remain remarkably consistent. To understand tariffs and trade policy today, it helps to look far back, much farther than the modern nation-state or industrial economy. Trade itself is ancient, and so are the taxes and tariffs that accompanied it. Across millennia, societies developed various systems to regulate commerce, secure revenue, and protect interests. Ancient trade systems may seem primitive compared to our complex global economy, but in many ways, they laid the groundwork for modern tariffs. One of the earliest recorded instances of trade taxation comes from Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. Around 3000 BCE, the Sumerians developed some of the first written legal codes, which included provisions for taxing goods moving through the city-states. Grain, the staple commodity, was central to these taxes. Archaeological evidence and cuneiform tablets reveal that merchants transporting grain to markets or between cities had to pay tariffs, sometimes a fixed percentage or a specific quantity. This not only raised revenue, but also allowed local rulers to monitor and control trade flows, ensuring stability and loyalty. These grain tariffs were vital because Mesopotamian economies depended heavily on agriculture, and controlling food supplies was crucial for political power. By taxing trade, rulers could finance large-scale projects like irrigation canals, temples, and armies. This early system shows a dual role of tariffs, as a revenue tool and a means of economic regulation. It's a pattern we will see repeating through history. Moving forward several centuries, we find another well-documented ancient trade taxation system in ancient Athens. Athens, at the height of its power in the 5th century BCE, imposed a modest but significant duty on imports and exports through its port of Piraeus. This was known as the 2% Piraeus duty. While small in percentage, this tariff was carefully administered and became an important source of revenue for the city-state. Athens was a maritime power, and Piraeus was one of the busiest ports in the ancient world. The tariff was charged on goods coming into the city and those shipped out, affecting merchants, traders, and even war fleets. The funds helped finance the city's navy, the lifeblood of Athenian dominance. This is a clear example of how tariffs could be linked to military power and strategic interests. Athens also used tariffs as instruments of political leverage. Friendly city-states or trading partners might receive preferential treatment, while enemies faced higher duties or outright bans. In this sense, trade policy was intertwined with diplomacy and warfare, just as we see in modern trade sanctions and embargoes. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire developed one of the most sophisticated and extensive tariff systems in the ancient world, the portoria. These were customs duties levied at ports, river crossings, and provincial borders. The Romans had a vast and diverse empire, stretching from Britain to Egypt, and their administration needed to regulate and tax the flow of goods across thousands of miles. The portoria system was highly organized. Taxes were assessed on a variety of goods, wine, olive oil, metals, textiles, and collected by officials stationed at checkpoints. Roman law codified tariffs in great detail, specifying rates and procedures. Importantly, these tariffs served not only as a revenue source, but also as a means of controlling the supply of goods to provinces and maintaining economic order. Portoria revenues funded the empire's military campaigns, public works, and administrative apparatus. The system also reinforced Roman dominance by controlling which goods could enter or leave certain regions. For example, luxury items or strategic resources might be restricted or heavily taxed, depending on political considerations. The Roman example shows how tariffs can be used as tools of empire building, both extracting wealth and asserting authority over diverse populations. This echoes later imperial systems, where economic control was a key pillar of political power. In the early Islamic world, tariffs took a somewhat different form, but continued the tradition of trade regulation and taxation. The caliphates, which expanded rapidly across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe, imposed the usher, a tithe or tax on agricultural produce and trade goods. Usher generally amounted to about 10% of the harvest or commercial value and was collected to support the Islamic State, including its religious institutions and welfare programs. The Islamic trade routes, connecting the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Silk Road, were bustling arteries of commerce. Tariffs like usher helped regulate this vast network and ensure that goods moving across regions contributed to the state's coffers. Importantly, the system also reflected Islamic principles of social justice, with provisions for exemptions and redistributions to the poor. Trade taxes in the Islamic world were often coupled with waqf endowments, charitable trusts funded by revenue from commercial properties or tolls. This created a sophisticated financial ecosystem where tariffs supported not only government, but also religious and social functions. Across these ancient systems, a few key themes emerge. First, tariffs were multifunctional. They raised revenue, regulated markets, supported military and political power, and sometimes embodied social or religious values. They were rarely neutral or purely economic. Instead, they were embedded in the broader fabric of society. Second, the administration of tariffs required bureaucracy and enforcement mechanisms. Even in ancient times, officials were stationed at ports and borders, and record-keeping was essential. This gave rise to early forms of customs services and legal frameworks governing trade, a foundation for the modern customs agencies we see today. Third, tariffs were linked to the geopolitics of their era. Whether the city-states of Greece, the Roman Empire, or the Islamic caliphates, trade taxes were tools of strategic control. They could be used to reward allies, punish rivals, or secure critical supplies. The link between trade and power was unmistakable. Finally, these ancient examples highlight how tariffs have always been a balance between open commerce and state control. Too heavy a burden could stifle trade and provoke resistance. Too light a touch could undermine revenue and authority. Ancient rulers had to navigate these tensions just as policymakers do now. Understanding these early systems helps us appreciate that tariffs are not a modern invention, but part of a long historical continuum. They are a window into how societies have balanced economic incentives, political power, and social needs across time and space. In the next chapter of our journey, we will explore how tariffs evolved during the mercantilist era, when nation-states began to take shape and trade became a battleground for empire and wealth on an unprecedented scale. As we move from the ancient world into the early modern period, the nature of tariffs begins to shift. In ancient times, trade taxes were largely tools of revenue and control, ways to fund states and empires, regulate markets, and occasionally reflect religious or social values. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, with the rise of strong centralized monarchies and the birth of the modern nation-state, a new economic philosophy emerged, mercantilism. And with it, tariffs took on a far more aggressive and strategic role. Mercantilism wasn't a single, unified theory, but a broad economic worldview that dominated Europe for nearly 2 centuries. Its central premise was that national wealth and power were closely tied to the accumulation of precious metals, especially gold and silver. Because international trade was viewed as a zero-sum game, where one nation's gain was another's loss, governments sought to maximize exports and minimize imports. In this context, tariffs became crucial weapons. The most famous embodiment of this strategy in the English-speaking world was the British Navigation Acts, a series of laws beginning in 1651. These acts were designed not just to raise revenue, but to control who could trade with England and its colonies. Specifically, they required that goods imported into England or its colonies had to be carried on English ships or ships from the producing country. Foreign merchants, particularly the Dutch, who dominated shipping at the time, were cut out of lucrative trade routes. These laws were protectionist in the extreme. They helped build a powerful English merchant marine and tied the colonies more tightly to the mother country by preventing them from trading freely with others. Over time, the Navigation Acts helped lay the foundation for the British Empire's economic dominance, but they also sowed seeds of resentment, especially in the American colonies, where many merchants and planters chafed under the restrictions. This frustration would explode in the following century during the American Revolution. The French had their own mercantilist pioneer, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, finance minister under Louis XIV. Colbert believed that economic power was essential to military strength and political glory. His version of mercantilism, often called Colbertism, focused heavily on protecting French industries from foreign competition. He imposed high tariffs on imports, subsidized key industries like textiles and glass, and encouraged the establishment of state-controlled companies to dominate overseas trade. Colbert's system was meticulous and far-reaching. He classified goods based on their strategic value, adjusted tariffs accordingly, and even tried to regulate the quality of domestic production to make French exports more competitive. He saw tariffs not just as taxes, but as instruments of industrial policy. His goal was to create a self-sufficient national economy that would feed into France's broader ambition to dominate Europe. This strategy had mixed results. While it did promote some industrial development and strengthen the French state, it also led to inefficiencies, corruption, and trade disputes with neighbors. Still, the legacy of Colbertism lived on, influencing French economic policy well into the 19th and even 20th centuries. On the other side of the Atlantic, American colonial tariffs were both a reflection of mercantilist policy and a source of deepening conflict. The British Crown imposed a series of tariffs and trade restrictions on the American colonies to ensure that raw materials flowed to England and that colonial markets remained captive to British manufacturers. The Sugar Act of 1764, for example, imposed duties on imported molasses and other goods, while the Townshend Acts of 1767 taxed items like glass, paint, and tea. While these tariffs raised revenue, their larger purpose was to assert imperial control and uphold the mercantilist model. Colonists viewed them as unjust impositions, taxation without representation, and responded with boycotts, smuggling, and eventually revolution. Tariffs, in this context, were not just economic measures, they became symbols of colonial oppression and catalysts for political upheaval. It's important to understand how deeply embedded tariffs were in the logic of mercantilism. This was not a world of free trade or comparative advantage. Instead, each nation sought to protect its industries, secure its markets, and outmaneuver its rivals. Tariffs were a tool of national strategy, akin to fortresses and navies. Trade wars weren't just possible, they were expected. Mercantilism also had global dimensions. European powers used tariffs and trade monopolies to extract wealth from their colonies while preventing them from developing independent economies. In the Caribbean and the Americas, this often meant heavy taxes on sugar, tobacco, and other cash crops, combined with restrictions that prevented the colonies from producing finished goods. Colonies were to supply raw materials and consume manufactured goods from the mother country. This created a structural dependency that persisted long after the formal empires dissolved. Another aspect of mercantilism, often overlooked, is its role in shaping early economic nationalism. Tariffs helped forge a sense of identity and unity within emerging states. By protecting domestic industries and excluding foreign competition, governments were essentially saying, "Our economy is ours to control." This was particularly important in countries trying to consolidate power after centuries of feudal division. Of course, not everyone agreed with mercantilist policies. Even in the 18th century, critics began to question whether tariffs really made nations wealthier. Scottish economist Adam Smith, writing in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, attacked mercantilism as a misguided system that confused money with real wealth. He argued that tariffs distorted markets, hurt consumers, and prevented nations from benefiting from each other's strengths. Smith's ideas would eventually revolutionize economic thought, but during the height of the mercantilist era, they were still just whispers against a powerful tide. One can't discuss mercantilism without mentioning the role of monopolies, especially chartered companies like the British East India Company or the Dutch VOC. These entities were given exclusive rights to trade with certain regions, often backed by tariffs that excluded competitors. In return, they paid large sums to their governments and sometimes acted as quasi-states, complete with armies and governance structures. Here, tariffs were not just economic instruments, they were licenses to conquer and control. Mercantilist policies also influenced tariff structures in Asia, although the story there was more complicated. For example, China under the Ming and Qing dynasties imposed strict controls on foreign trade, often limiting it to designated ports like Canton and restricting it to certain periods. While not tariffs in the Western sense, these measures functioned similarly by regulating and restricting market access for foreign merchants. The eventual clash between Chinese restrictions and British free trade ambitions would lead to the infamous Opium Wars of the 19th century, but that comes later. In retrospect, the mercantilist era reveals the deep interconnection between economics and statecraft. Tariffs were not just fiscal tools or economic policies, they were reflections of a broader worldview, one that saw national prosperity as inherently competitive and international trade as a battlefield. Protectionism was not a policy, it was the policy. The age of mercantilism left a lasting mark. It shaped the contours of empire, fueled colonial rebellions, and set the stage for future debates about free trade and economic integration. The scars and structures it left behind are still visible today, especially in post-colonial economies and trade relationships. As we move next into the Industrial Revolution, we'll see how the world begins to question these mercantilist assumptions. New economic theories emerge, trade networks shift, and tariffs once again evolve, this time in response to the transformative power of machines, markets, and mass production. The Industrial Revolution was not just a technological transformation. It was a seismic shift in how economies functioned, how societies were structured, and how governments approached trade policy. From the late 18th century into the 19th, industrialization swept through Britain and later across Europe, North America, and beyond. Steam power, mechanization, and factory production revolutionized manufacturing. And as goods poured out of mills and forges in unprecedented volumes, questions about tariffs, who should impose them, whom they should protect, and what they should accomplish, rose to the forefront of national policy debates. One of the defining tariff battles of the Industrial Revolution occurred in Britain with the controversy over the Corn Laws. Passed in 1815, at the close of the Napoleonic Wars, these laws imposed steep tariffs on imported grain, corn in the British usage. Their purpose was clear: to protect domestic landowners and farmers from a flood of cheap grain from abroad, particularly from continental Europe and North America. British aristocrats, who dominated Parliament, feared that free trade in food would depress land values and undermine the agrarian economy. But industrialization was changing everything. Britain's urban population was growing rapidly, and the working class in Manchester, Birmingham, and other industrial hubs relied on affordable bread. High grain prices, maintained by the Corn Laws, meant hunger, unrest, and economic inefficiency. Meanwhile, industrialists wanted cheaper food so they could pay workers lower wages and remain globally competitive. The Corn Laws quickly became a lightning rod in British politics. The Anti-Corn Law League, led by men like Richard Cobden and John Bright, mobilized public opinion against them. They argued that the tariffs not only hurt the poor, but also distorted markets and hindered Britain's transformation into a modern industrial powerhouse. Their campaign combined mass politics, economic argument, and moral urgency, marking one of the first major popular movements for free trade in the modern world. After decades of pressure, and amid the potato famine in Ireland and a general food crisis, the Corn Laws were finally repealed in 1846. The moment marked a turning point, not just in British history, but in the global shift from mercantilist protectionism toward free trade ideology. Britain would soon declare itself the workshop of the world, exporting goods to all corners of the empire and beyond, confident in its industrial strength. While Britain moved toward freer trade, Germany, or more accurately, the fragmented German states, took a different path. In 1834, the Zollverein was established, a customs union that sought to eliminate internal tariffs among the various German principalities and create a unified economic space. It was not a political unification yet, but economically it was revolutionary. The Zollverein standardized weights, measures, and tariffs across dozens of states, creating a common external tariff for goods coming from outside the Union. It gave Prussia, the dominant state in the Union, significant influence and laid the groundwork for the later political unification of Germany in 1871. More importantly, it showed how tariffs could be used not just for exclusion, but for integration, to bind together fragmented markets and promote industrial development. The Zollverein helped stimulate domestic production by protecting German industries from British competition. At the same time, it allowed German producers access to a larger internal market. As industrial capacity grew in the Rhine Valley, Saxony, and Silesia, Germany transformed from a patchwork of agrarian states into an industrial contender. Tariffs, in this case, were both a shield and a scaffold, protecting infant industries while helping to build national unity. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, tariffs played yet another role during this industrial period, one deeply intertwined with national politics and sectional conflict. From its early days, the U.S. had debated the role of tariffs. Alexander Hamilton, in his 1791 Report on Manufactures, argued that the new nation should protect and nurture its industries through tariffs and subsidies. Thomas Jefferson and his allies, representing agrarian interests, preferred free trade and feared the growth of centralized economic power. These tensions persisted through the 19th century, but industrialization, especially in the North, strengthened the protectionist argument. Southern states, heavily reliant on cotton exports, wanted access to cheap manufactured goods and feared retaliatory tariffs from foreign buyers. Northern manufacturers, by contrast, demanded tariffs to protect them from British and European imports. The Morrill Tariff, passed in 1861, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, sharply raised tariff rates. It marked a decisive turn toward protectionism in U.S. trade policy. Named after Justin Morrill, a Vermont congressman, the law was designed to support American industry during a time of national crisis. The South, which had long opposed high tariffs, saw the measure as another example of northern dominance, a view that further exacerbated sectional tensions. During the Civil War, tariffs became a critical revenue source for the Union government. After the war, high tariffs remained a staple of U.S. policy through much of the late 19th century. They helped fuel the growth of industries in steel, textiles, and railroads. American factories, insulated from foreign competition, expanded rapidly. However, they also contributed to growing monopolies, price manipulation, and labor unrest. Throughout this industrial period, tariffs were not just economic tools, they were ideological battlegrounds. Protectionists argued that tariffs were essential for nation building, job creation, and independence. Free traders insisted they harmed consumers, distorted markets, and entrenched elites. These debates shaped party politics, especially in countries like Britain and the US, where tariff policy was a defining issue for decades. It's also worth noting that the Industrial Revolution altered the nature of the goods being traded. In the mercantilist era, trade focused on raw materials, spices, and precious metals. Now, the trade was about finished manufactured goods, textiles, machinery, iron, steel. The scale and complexity of trade exploded, and tariffs had to evolve to match. Nations began to use differentiated tariff structures, with varying rates depending on the type of good, its origin, and its intended use. This complexity reflected the growing sophistication of both production and policy. The goal was often to protect key sectors, steel, textiles, shipbuilding, while maintaining access to necessary raw materials. But industrialization also made retaliation more likely. As countries imposed tariffs to protect their own industries, others responded in kind. Trade wars became a feature of the global economy as nations jockeyed for advantage in an increasingly interconnected yet competitive world. By the end of the 19th century, the world stood at a crossroads. Britain had largely embraced free trade, confident in its industrial preeminence. Germany, the US, and others followed more protectionist paths, using tariffs to catch up and compete. The divide between these models would shape international relations and global economic policy for generations. Tariffs during the Industrial Revolution were not simply about taxes on imports. They were about nation building, industrial strategy, class conflict, and the emergence of the modern state. They touched on the lives of ordinary workers, influenced the decisions of governments, and often determined whether a country would rise or fall in the new industrial order. As we turn next to the late 19th century, we'll see how this tension between free trade and protectionism intensifies, leading to new tariff regimes, rising nationalism, and the roots of the conflicts that would eventually engulf the world in the 20th century. By the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had spread across Europe and North America, creating not just new industries, but entirely new social and political dynamics. The rapid urbanization, class formation, and expansion of global markets gave rise to powerful new interests: manufacturers, industrial workers, agrarian conservatives, and each had something to say about trade policy. Tariffs, once simple instruments of revenue or colonial control, were now the focal point of national debates about identity, economic justice, and survival in an increasingly interconnected world. In Germany, the iron and rye tariffs of 1879 epitomized the strategic realignment of tariff policy to suit both industrial and agricultural elites. Following the unification of Germany in 1871, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had initially allowed free trade to support industrial development. But by the late 1870s, Germany was facing a severe economic downturn, brought on by the global depression that followed the Panic of 1873. Prices for agricultural goods were collapsing, threatening the livelihoods of the Prussian Junker aristocracy, Germany's powerful landed elite. At the same time, industrialists, who had once favored cheap raw materials and open trade, began to demand protection from growing British competition. Bismarck, the consummate political pragmatist, saw an opportunity. In 1879, he introduced a set of protective tariffs that served two purposes. They shielded German agriculture from cheap imports, especially grain from America and Russia, and they protected emerging industrial sectors, particularly steel and coal, from British dominance. These tariffs became known as the Iron and Rye Tariffs, a nod to the alliance between industrial magnates and agrarian conservatives. This tariff policy was more than economic. It was deeply political. By protecting the interests of both groups, Bismarck was able to build a conservative coalition that could stabilize the newly unified German Empire. Tariffs thus became part of a broader strategy to contain socialism, strengthen the central state, and assert Germany's rising power on the world stage. Economically, the tariffs worked in the short term. They spurred domestic production and gave German firms time to modernize, but they also entrenched cartels, distorted markets, and stifled competition. Politically, they laid the groundwork for a highly managed economy that would persist into the 20th century. Across the Atlantic, the United States was forging its own path. By the 1890s, America had become a major industrial power, rivaling Britain in output and surpassing it in some sectors like steel and oil. Yet the debate over tariffs remained fierce. In 1890, the McKinley Tariff, named after future President William McKinley, then a congressman from Ohio, dramatically raised import duties to an average rate of nearly 50%. It was one of the highest tariff levels in U.S. history. The McKinley Tariff was a classic protectionist measure aimed at safeguarding American manufacturers and promoting domestic production. It was backed by Republicans and the industrial elite, but drew heavy criticism from farmers and working-class consumers. Prices for everyday goods rose, fueling resentment and stoking populist anger. Many Americans in rural areas, already burdened by debt and falling crop prices, saw the tariff as a form of legalized robbery, enriching factory owners in the North at the expense of struggling communities in the South and West. The backlash was swift. In the 1890 midterm elections, the Republican Party suffered a crushing defeat, losing control of the House of Representatives. The McKinley Tariff became a political liability, though it would remain in place in various forms. The episode illustrates how, in late 19th century America, tariffs were not just economic policy. They were election-defining, coalition-shaping forces. Meanwhile, in France, the Malines Tariff of 1892 marked a decisive turn toward agricultural protectionism. Named after Jules Malines, a staunch advocate of rural interests and future prime minister, the law raised duties on a wide range of agricultural products, including wheat, barley, meat, and wine. Like Bismarck's tariffs, the Malines Tariff was a response to the falling prices caused by cheap imports, particularly American grain, and was aimed at preserving the traditional structure of French society. France in the late 19th century was still largely rural, and many politicians saw agriculture as the bedrock of national stability. The mainline tariff was portrayed as a way to protect the peasant farmer, the backbone of the republic, from the ravages of global capitalism. But it also protected large landowners and made food more expensive for urban consumers. Industrial workers, who were already suffering from low wages and poor conditions, found themselves paying more for basic necessities. The tariff also reignited tensions between urban and rural, capital and labor, and national and international interests. It created a defensive economic posture that persisted well into the 20th century and influenced French attitudes toward globalization and European integration for decades. Even today, echoes of the mainline logic can be heard in debates over the common agricultural policy and food sovereignty. So why did tariffs become so controversial and politicized in this period? First, the global economy was changing fast. Thanks to steamships, railroads, and the telegraph, goods, capital, and information were moving across borders like never before. Countries that had once been isolated were now exposed to global competition. This made both producers and consumers far more sensitive to tariff policy. Second, democracy was expanding. In countries like Britain, the US, Germany, and France, more people had the right to vote, and they brought with them diverse economic interests. Tariff policy was no longer a matter for elites alone. It had to navigate the pressures of mass politics. Workers wanted cheap goods, farmers wanted fair prices, and industrialists wanted protection. Balancing these demands became increasingly difficult. Third, there was a growing tension between national sovereignty and global interdependence. Tariffs were one of the last levers of national economic control. As trade flows intensified and empires expanded, leaders used tariffs to assert autonomy, reward supporters, and shape the development of their economies. But each act of protectionism provoked a reaction. Retaliatory tariffs, trade disputes, and diplomatic friction became common. And finally, this era saw the emergence of powerful economic ideologies. Protectionism was often linked with nationalism, conservatism, and a belief in self-sufficiency. Free trade, by contrast, was associated with liberalism, cosmopolitanism, and a belief in market rationality. These ideologies weren't just academic, they were carried into parliaments, newspapers, and public squares, fueling movements that would shape the 20th century. By the end of the 19th century, tariffs had become both a shield and a sword. They protected economies from volatility, but also divided societies and provoked international tension. They created winners and losers, and those outcomes often mapped onto political power. As a result, tariffs became embedded in national identities, political parties, and strategic doctrines. The late 1800s were not yet the age of total economic warfare, but they laid the groundwork. As countries competed for markets, colonies, and strategic advantage, tariffs became tools of empire as much as economics. And as nationalism hardened and alliances frayed, trade disputes became more than just disagreements over price. They became early warnings of the cataclysms to come. As we move forward into the interwar period, we'll see how these unresolved tensions explode in the aftermath of World War I, ushering in a period of economic fragmentation, rising protectionism, and the infamous tariffs that many historians blame for deepening the Great Depression. The end of World War I in 1918 marked not only the collapse of empires, but the unraveling of a fragile global economic order. The world emerged from the conflict bloodied, traumatized, and economically unstable. Old certainties, like the gold standard, the Pax Britannica, and the relative stability of 19th-century trade networks, were gone. In their place came currency chaos, war debts, inflation, and deepening distrust between nations. In this fractured environment, tariff policy became both a shield and a weapon, a tool wielded in desperation as governments struggled to restore prosperity and protect domestic interests. The interwar years would come to be defined by rising protectionism, trade fragmentation, and a deepening global economic malaise that helped pave the way for World War II. One of the first major trade measures of the interwar era was the Fordney-Macumber Tariff, enacted by the United States in 1922. Named after Congressman Joseph Fordney and Senator Porter Macumber, the legislation was designed to protect American agriculture and industry from foreign competition as the U.S. transitioned from wartime to peacetime production. During World War I, European agriculture had been devastated, and the United States had become the world's breadbasket and manufacturing powerhouse. But with the war over, European countries began to recover and re-enter export markets, especially for agricultural goods. American farmers, who had borrowed heavily during the war to expand production, now found themselves facing plummeting prices and rising competition. At the same time, U.S. industry, flush with wartime profits, feared that cheap European imports, particularly textiles and chemicals, would undercut their markets. The Fordney-Macumber tariff responded by raising duties on a wide array of goods, making it one of the most protectionist measures in American history to that point. Critically, the law introduced the scientific tariff, a concept that tried to calculate the difference in production costs between the U.S. and other countries and adjust tariffs accordingly. In theory, this was an attempt at fairness. In practice, it opened the door to highly subjective judgments and heavy lobbying. Special interests quickly learned how to manipulate the system to their advantage. The tariff did succeed in shielding American industries, but it also provoked retaliation. European nations, many of which were already struggling to recover from the war, found their exports blocked from one of the world's richest markets. They responded in kind, raising their own tariffs against American goods. Trade slowed, political tensions rose, and global recovery was hindered. But it was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 that became the symbol of interwar economic failure. Often remembered as one of the most catastrophic economic policy mistakes in modern history, Smoot-Hawley raised U.S. tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels. Sponsored by Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon, the bill was originally intended to support American farmers during the early stages of the Great Depression. But as it moved through Congress, it became a magnet for lobbyists, who flooded lawmakers with requests to add protections for thousands of products. The resulting legislation was a grotesque patchwork of political favors and economic distortions, a classic case of congressional logrolling in which legislators traded votes to ensure their local industries received protection. The bill passed over the objections of over 1,000 economists who signed a letter warning President Herbert Hoover that the tariff would worsen the Depression, not relieve it, and they were right. Within months of Smoot-Hawley's passage, America's trading partners retaliated aggressively. Canada imposed tariffs on U.S. goods ranging from wheat to automobiles. France and Britain followed suit. Germany enacted its own barriers. International trade collapsed. Between 1929 and 1934, global trade fell by more than 60%, a staggering contraction that deepened the global depression and inflamed nationalist sentiment. The economic damage was severe, but the political damage may have been even greater. Countries turned inward, seeking self-sufficiency and embracing economic nationalism. International cooperation broke down. Fascist and authoritarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan used the language of economic victimhood to justify expansionist policies. The global trading system fractured along political lines, mirroring the fault lines that would soon erupt into world war. In contrast to the destructiveness of Smoot-Hawley, other countries during the interwar period tried more coordinated, if flawed, approaches to trade. One notable example was the imperial preference system, promoted by Britain and formalized at the Ottawa Conference of 1932. Facing economic collapse and growing competition from American and German industries, Britain sought to reinforce trade within the British Empire by giving preferential treatment to imperial goods and erecting barriers to non-imperial imports. This was a dramatic shift for a country that had once been the staunchest advocate of free trade. The decision marked the end of an era in which Britain's ports were open to the world. Now, in the face of global depression, the empire turned inward. Under imperial preference, colonies and dominions such as Canada, Australia, and India agreed to lower tariffs on British goods in exchange for similar treatment from the mother country. The goal was to keep economic activity within the imperial family and insulate it from global shocks. While the system provided some short-term relief to imperial producers, it also distorted global markets and excluded non-imperial nations from access to vital trade routes. Moreover, it contributed to a broader trend of regional trade blocs and economic nationalism, as other countries followed suit, forming their own exclusive zones of commerce. By the late 1930s, the global trading system was effectively balkanized. Instead of a cohesive, integrated global economy, the world was divided into hostile trading spheres, each with its own tariffs, preferences, and exclusions. The United States stood behind its high walls of protectionism. The British Empire traded largely within itself. Germany developed the New Plan, a system of bilateral trade deals aimed at securing raw materials for its militarizing economy. Japan pursued its own version of economic autarky, fueling its expansion into Manchuria and China. This fragmentation made international cooperation nearly impossible. Institutions that might have mediated disputes or stabilized trade, such as the League of Nations, were too weak or lacked the economic mandate. Without a multilateral framework, nations resorted to tariffs, quotas, and currency manipulation to pursue their interests. Economic diplomacy gave way to strategic confrontation, and yet, within this gloomy landscape, there were a few glimmers of understanding. The lessons of the interwar period would not be lost on the generation that followed. Policymakers who watched the collapse of global trade in the 1930s began to recognize that uncoordinated protectionism could be just as dangerous as war itself. They would carry this insight into the post-war era, laying the foundations for a new international order built not on tariffs and rivalry, but on rules, institutions, and cooperation. But in the moment, during the 1920s and 30s, tariffs symbolized failure. Failure to adapt to post-war realities, failure to see beyond narrow national interests, failure to understand the interconnectedness of modern economies. And as economies collapsed and tempers flared, protectionism went from being an economic tool to a political accelerant, fueling nationalism, militarism, and ultimately conflict. When we turn next to the post-World War II system, we'll see how world leaders attempted to learn from these failures, constructing a new framework for international trade, one that would seek not to divide nations through tariffs, but to bind them through cooperation, compromise, and multilateralism. In the smoldering aftermath of the Second World War, a profound shift occurred in the way nations thought about trade. The global economy had just experienced its most violent interruption, 2 world wars within 3 decades, bracketed by a collapse in international commerce that helped drive the Great Depression and fuel the rise of authoritarian regimes. For the victors of World War II, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, one lesson was clear: the uncoordinated, protectionist, and competitive trade policies of the past had not just failed, they had helped bring about global catastrophe. The task ahead was enormous. Cities were in ruins, economies were shattered, confidence in global cooperation was fragile. And yet, amid the rubble, a group of economists, diplomats, and statesmen dared to imagine a different kind of world, one built on the principle that trade, if governed by rules and anchored in institutions, could be a force not of division, but of peace and prosperity. From that conviction emerged a new vision of international economic governance. Central to this vision was the idea that lowering trade barriers, tariffs, quotas, and discriminatory practices could help nations rebuild more quickly, reduce economic friction, and prevent the nationalist economic spirals that had contributed to global war. In 1944, as Allied victory became increasingly certain, representatives of 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to plan the contours of the post-war economic order. While much of the Bretton Woods Conference focused on monetary systems, the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, it also laid the intellectual groundwork for a new trade regime. That project would take form in the years that followed. In 1947, after years of negotiation, a major breakthrough was achieved with the signing of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. Though intended as a temporary arrangement, while the more ambitious International Trade Organization, ITO, was debated, GATT would become the backbone of global trade governance for nearly 50 years. GATT was revolutionary in its simplicity and scope. At its heart were 3 principles: non-discrimination, reciprocity, and transparency. The cornerstone was the most favored nation, MFN, principle. If one country granted another a trade concession, it had to extend that same benefit to all other GATT members. This ensured a level playing field and discouraged the kind of exclusive, retaliatory trade blocs that had defined the interwar period. The initial GATT agreement included just 23 countries and covered around 45,000 tariff concessions. But it set in motion a process that would define the global economy for decades: the gradual, rules-based liberalization of trade. Tariff reductions were negotiated through a series of rounds, each building on the last and expanding the agreement's reach and depth. One of the earliest and most significant rounds came in the 1960s, with the Kennedy Round, 1964–1967. Named after the late U.S. President, This round reflected a growing sense of urgency about global economic integration. The Kennedy Round achieved an average tariff cut of about 35% on industrial goods among participating nations and was notable for introducing anti-dumping rules, a recognition that unfair pricing by exporters could distort competition as much as tariffs. But the Kennedy Round also exposed the limits of early GATT. As tariffs on industrial goods fell, new kinds of trade barriers began to emerge, non-tariff barriers, such as import quotas, technical standards, and subsidies. These measures were harder to quantify, harder to negotiate, and often deeply embedded in domestic political systems. To address this, GATT members launched the Tokyo Round, 1973–1979, which sought to broaden the trade agenda. Negotiators aimed not only to reduce tariffs, but also to bring non-tariff measures under international rules. The Tokyo Round produced a series of codes on subsidies, standards, and public procurement. But it also deepened the divide between developed and developing countries, many of which felt that the new rules disproportionately constrained their development policy space while favoring the already industrialized nations. Despite these tensions, GATT played a transformative role in the post-war economy. Under its framework, global trade expanded dramatically. Between 1950 and 1990, world trade grew at an average rate of over 6% per year, twice the rate of global GDP. Countries rebuilt, middle classes expanded, and economies diversified. Europe, devastated by war, became a thriving integrated market. Japan, once an imperial aggressor, reinvented itself as an export powerhouse. Even formerly colonized nations found that trade, if supported by infrastructure, investment, and fair rules, could be a pathway to growth. But GATT was not without flaws. It was never a true international organization. It lacked enforcement power and institutional depth. Dispute resolution was slow and consensus-based. Moreover, its coverage was narrow. Services, agriculture, intellectual property, and investment, all crucial parts of the modern economy, remained largely outside its remit, and participation was uneven. Many developing countries remained marginal players, excluded from key decisions and unable to enforce their rights under the agreement. By the late 1980s, the world had changed again. The Cold War was winding down. The global economy had become far more complex. New technologies, financial markets, and service industries were reshaping how business was done. The GATT framework, built for a simpler time, began to buckle under the strain. Trade disputes multiplied, and frustration mounted. This led to the most ambitious negotiation round yet, the Uruguay Round, launched in 1986. After 8 grueling years of negotiation, the Uruguay Round culminated in 1994 with the Marrakesh Agreement, which created a new, more robust institution, the World Trade Organization, or WTO. The WTO would inherit GATT's core principles, but expand its scope dramatically. For the first time, services, intellectual property, and trade-related investment measures were brought into the multilateral system. The WTO also introduced a formal dispute settlement body, with legal panels and the ability to authorize retaliatory measures, making its rulings more enforceable than anything under GATT. But those changes lay ahead. During the immediate post-war period, the 1940s through the 1980s, it was GATT that held the system together. It provided the rules, the forum, and the momentum needed to guide the world away from the brink of another economic collapse. It helped rebuild trust between nations, lower trade barriers, and establish the idea that cooperation, not confrontation, was the better path to prosperity. It is difficult to overstate how different this vision was from the one that had prevailed before. In the 1930s, tariffs had been walls. Trade was a zero-sum game. The world was carved into hostile blocks. By contrast, the GATT system embodied the post-war liberal ideal that economic interdependence could foster peace and that multilateral rules could substitute for brute power. This ideal was not always realized, and over time, the system would face new challenges, from globalization's discontents to the rise of economic nationalism once again. But in those formative post-war decades, the architects of GATT succeeded in building not just a framework for trade, but a foundation for international order. As we move into the era of modern globalization, the story becomes more complex. The WTO's birth, the rise of China, the failure of ambitious multilateral rounds, and the resurgence of protectionism all point to new tensions. But all of them have their roots in the post-war decisions made when the world stood at a crossroads and chose, for a time, to lower its walls. By the early 1990s, the post-war global order had shifted fundamentally. The Cold War was ending, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and capitalism was now the dominant global economic model. Markets were liberalizing, the internet was on the horizon, and international capital flows had grown exponentially. In this environment of optimism, the momentum that had driven decades of tariff reductions under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) culminated in the creation of a new and more powerful institution, the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Established in 1995, the WTO represented a major step forward in the evolution of the multilateral trading system. It absorbed the legal framework of GATT, but extended its reach dramatically. For the first time, services, intellectual property rights, and investment measures were incorporated into binding international rules. It wasn't just about goods crossing borders anymore. It was about everything from banking and insurance to software and pharmaceuticals. Unlike GATT, the WTO had teeth. Its dispute settlement body could issue binding rulings and authorize retaliation if a member failed to comply. This made the organization not just a negotiating forum, but a global court of trade. Suddenly, smaller nations had a venue where they could challenge economic giants and sometimes win. The creation of the WTO was not merely a bureaucratic rebranding. It was a symbolic affirmation of a new era of hyperglobalization, where production chains spanned continents and information flowed instantaneously. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, the world witnessed a rapid acceleration in trade volumes, foreign direct investment, and the outsourcing of manufacturing to lower-cost countries. No event better symbolized this transformation than China's accession to the WTO in 2001. After years of negotiation, Beijing agreed to reduce tariffs, open markets, and reform its economy in exchange for access to the global trading system. For multinational corporations, it was a seismic opportunity, a vast labor force, low costs, and a government committed to attracting foreign investment. For China, WTO membership was a ticket to economic modernization, and it worked. Within a decade, China became the world's factory, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty while flooding global markets with inexpensive manufactured goods. But China's rise also sowed seeds of discontent. In the United States, Europe, and parts of the global South, critics warned that the rules of globalization were skewed. Factories closed, jobs disappeared, and communities were hollowed out. Economists had long argued that the gains from trade outweighed the losses, but they underestimated who would bear the costs and how deeply those losses would be felt. The theory of comparative advantage didn't prepare anyone for the political consequences of massive deindustrialization in Ohio or northern England. Still, in the early 2000s, optimism remained high. The WTO launched its most ambitious initiative yet, the Doha Development Round, named after the capital of Qatar, where it was inaugurated in 2001. The goal was to address imbalances in the global trading system, especially the structural disadvantages faced by developing countries. Key topics included reducing agricultural subsidies in wealthy countries, opening industrial markets in the global South, and enhancing access to essential medicines. But the Doha round quickly became bogged down. Developed countries were reluctant to dismantle their agricultural protection, particularly subsidies for US and European farmers. Meanwhile, emerging economies like India, Brazil, and China pushed for greater policy space to nurture their own industries. Rich countries wanted access to developing markets for services and intellectual property, but developing nations feared this would stifle their growth and sovereignty. Years of negotiation passed with little to show. Deadlines were missed, trust eroded. By the 2010s, the Doha round was effectively dead, although it was never officially declared so. The failure was a sobering moment for the WTO and for the entire vision of multilateralism. It exposed the growing divergence between the interests of different economic blocs and the challenge of consensus in a system with nearly 160 members. In the vacuum left by Doha, countries began to shift focus to regional and bilateral trade agreements. These pacts were faster, more flexible, and more responsive to national priorities. They allowed like-minded partners to negotiate deeper commitments without being held hostage by the slow, often paralyzed WTO process. Meanwhile, globalization itself was evolving. It was no longer just about goods crossing borders. Digital services, data flows, e-commerce, and platform economies became central to international commerce. But the WTO, still grounded in rules crafted in the 20th century, struggled to keep up. For example, disputes arose over whether digital streaming services should be treated as goods or services, and who had the right to tax or regulate them. The 2008 global financial crisis further complicated matters. Trade volumes plummeted, governments erected temporary protectionist barriers, and public faith in globalization faltered. Populist movements across Europe and the United States seized on trade as a scapegoat, railing against free trade agreements and institutions like the WTO. Nowhere was this backlash more pronounced than in the United States. Long considered the chief architect and defender of the post-war trade system, the US began to question its role. In both political parties, skepticism of trade agreements grew. Critics pointed to the China shock, the economic dislocation caused by Chinese imports, as evidence that globalization had been poorly managed and insufficiently cushioned. Into this environment stepped more confrontational trade strategies, especially under the Trump administration, which viewed multilateralism as a constraint rather than a benefit. The United States launched trade wars, imposed tariffs, and began to sideline the WTO, blocking new appointments to its appellate body and rendering its dispute resolution mechanism inoperable by 2020. At the same time, a new generation of trade issues began to rise, issues that the WTO had not yet meaningfully addressed. One was climate change, with proposals like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, essentially tariffs on carbon-intensive imports, gaining traction in Europe. Another was data sovereignty, as nations asserted control over digital flows in the name of privacy and security. And then there was public health, which reignited debates over pharmaceutical patents, supply chains, and vaccine access. Modern globalization had become a paradox. On one hand, trade was more integrated than ever. On the other, the political consensus behind it was eroding. Trust in multilateral institutions was declining. Developing countries felt marginalized. Developed countries grappled with domestic backlash. And the WTO, once hailed as the crown jewel of the post-war economic order, seemed adrift. Still, despite its problems, the idea of a rules-based global trading system persisted. Countries continued to rely on WTO norms and data. Smaller economies still viewed the institution as a crucial platform for voicing concerns and securing fair treatment. And despite the paralysis in some areas, new plurilateral initiatives began to emerge. Groups of countries negotiating specific rules on topics like digital trade or environmental goods, without waiting for universal consensus. Modern globalization, then, is best understood not as a single arc, but as a contested space, a complex, dynamic arena where ideas, interests, and ideologies collide. The promise of trade as a driver of development, innovation, and peace remains alive. But so too does the fear that without reform, transparency, and accountability, globalization may fracture further into rival blocs, into managed trade, or into a system where power matters more than rules. What happens next will depend not only on governments and trade negotiators, but on civil society, workers, businesses, and the public at large. The story of modern globalization is still unfolding, and it is one of the defining dramas of the 21st century. The 21st century has not been kind to the spirit of global trade cooperation. While the early 2000s carried the promise of integration and shared prosperity, the second decade brought a sharp reversal, one that took the world back to a more adversarial, more protectionist mindset. Trade, once seen as a benign instrument of peace and economic growth, became a weapon in strategic rivalries. Nowhere was this more visible than in the unfolding of the 21st century trade wars. At the heart of this shift was a growing economic nationalism, fueled by disillusionment with globalization, domestic political pressures, and the intensifying rivalry between the United States and China. The global financial crisis of 2008 had already eroded public trust in elite institutions, but it was in the late 2010s that trade became a focal point for political backlash, particularly in advanced economies. The most prominent flashpoint came in 2018, when the United States, under President Donald Trump, invoked national security to justify tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. Using Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the administration imposed a 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum, citing concerns about overcapacity and the erosion of domestic production. The move was controversial not only because of its economic logic, but also because it targeted traditional U.S. allies, including Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. These tariffs triggered immediate retaliation. Canada responded with its own levies on American whiskey, ketchup, and even maple syrup. The EU struck back with tariffs on Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Levi's jeans. The trade tensions snowballed, injecting uncertainty into global supply chains and markets. But the biggest confrontation was yet to come. That same year, the United States launched a full-scale trade war with China, the world's second-largest economy. The Trump administration accused China of unfair trade practices, including forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and heavy state subsidies to domestic firms. The administration placed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods in July 2018, escalating over the next 2 years to cover more than $360 billion of imports. China responded in kind, targeting American soybeans, aircraft, and automobiles. These tit-for-tat measures marked a significant rupture in U.S.-China economic relations. For decades, engagement had been the strategy. Trade and investment were supposed to integrate China into the rules-based global system. But now, the narrative had flipped. Beijing was no longer seen as a partner in development, but as a strategic rival. Trade policy became national security policy. Businesses scrambled to adjust. Multinationals relocated factories, reassessed supply chains, and passed on costs to consumers. Farmers in the American Midwest, long reliant on exports to China, were hit hard. In response, the U.S. government rolled out billions of dollars in subsidies to cushion the blow. Meanwhile, stock markets swung wildly with every new tariff announcement or hint of de-escalation. In January 2020, the two sides signed a Phase 1 agreement. China committed to increase purchases of U.S. goods and services by $200 billion over 2 years and made vague promises to improve intellectual property protection. In return, the U.S. rolled back some tariffs, but kept many others in place. The deal was heralded by the administration as a victory, but independent analyses later showed that China fell far short of its purchase commitments, and the underlying tensions remained unresolved. This new era of economic confrontation wasn't limited to tariffs. The U.S. increasingly turned to export controls and investment restrictions to curb China's technological ambitions. Semiconductors, 5G equipment, AI systems, these became the new battlegrounds. Washington placed Huawei and other Chinese firms on export blacklists, limiting their access to critical American technologies. China responded by accelerating its push for technological self-sufficiency, pouring billions into domestic R&D and declaring a strategy of dual circulation, prioritizing internal consumption over dependence on global markets. Trade wars also extended into multilateral forums. The United States, frustrated with what it saw as Chinese non-compliance with WTO rules, began to undermine the very institution it had once championed. In 2019, Washington blocked appointments to the WTO's appellate body, effectively paralyzing the organization's dispute resolution mechanism. Without a functioning appeals process, countries had fewer tools to challenge unfair trade practices or defend themselves against unjust accusations. Meanwhile, Europe began to rethink its trade tools in light of climate change. As part of its Green Deal, the European Union proposed a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. This system would impose tariffs on imports of carbon-intensive goods, like steel, cement, and aluminium, unless the exporting country had equivalent environmental policies. The logic was clear. Without such a mechanism, aggressive climate regulation at home could lead to carbon leakage, where production simply moves to countries with laxer standards. But the proposal raised immediate concerns about protectionism, WTO compatibility, and the risk of sparking yet another round of trade disputes. Elsewhere, India, Brazil, Russia, and others took their own steps to shield domestic industries and assert economic sovereignty. Protectionist tendencies, once seen as outdated relics of the 20th century, were now very much back in fashion. And then came the pandemic. Global trade volumes plummeted as borders closed and supply chains broke. Shortages of masks, ventilators, and vaccines led to a new round of export bans and nationalist policies. Countries scrambled to reshore critical manufacturing, from pharmaceuticals to semiconductors. The logic was no longer just economic efficiency, but resilience, a buzzword that would define trade policy discussions in the years that followed. By 2021, as the Biden administration took office in the US, there was hope for a reset. But while the rhetoric softened, the underlying trade posture remained cautious. Tariffs on China were left in place. The focus shifted toward worker-centered trade policy, supply chain resilience, and coordinating with allies to manage China's rise rather than confronting it unilaterally. Meanwhile, China doubled down on its trade ambitions. It joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, a massive free trade agreement with 14 other Asia-Pacific nations, and applied to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. It also rolled out the Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious infrastructure and trade strategy spanning Asia, Africa, and Europe. These moves reinforced Beijing's intention to reshape the global trade architecture on its own terms. Between 2018 and 2025, the trade war between the US and China evolved from a series of tariff exchanges into a long-term strategic competition. Tariffs were only the beginning. Controls on data, AI, green tech, and rare earth minerals followed. Countries no longer just wanted free trade. They wanted secure trade, controlled trade, and in some cases, dominant trade. What distinguishes the 21st century trade wars from previous eras is the interdependence of the combatants. In the past, trade wars often occurred between rivals with relatively limited economic ties. But the US and China are deeply intertwined, financially, commercially, technologically. As the multilateral trading system struggled with deadlock and division in the 21st century, a new paradigm began to rise, one rooted not in universal consensus, but in regional cooperation. Regional trade agreements had existed for decades, but now they were expanding in scope, ambition, and geopolitical significance. In a world where global deals were increasingly hard to achieve, these regional pacts emerged as the engines of modern trade policy. The rationale was straightforward. Multilateral institutions like the WTO required unanimity among more than 160 countries, a Herculean task in an era of diverging interests and rising nationalism. By contrast, regional deals could be tailored to specific priorities, negotiated more rapidly, and enforced through shared institutions or bilateral diplomacy. They also allowed countries to go deeper than what multilateral rules permitted, liberalizing not just tariffs, but services, investments, labor standards, environmental rules, and digital trade. In North America, the most high-profile regional shift came in the form of the USMCA, the United States, Mexico-Canada Agreement, which replaced NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA, launched in 1994, had deeply integrated the economies of the three countries, creating vast cross-border supply chains and transforming industries like automotive and agriculture. But by the 2010s, it had become politically toxic in the United States. Critics argued that NAFTA had led to job losses, factory closures, and a race to the bottom on wages and environmental standards. The Trump administration vowed to renegotiate or scrap it entirely. After months of tense talks and brinkmanship, including threats to withdraw from NAFTA, negotiators agreed in 2018 to a revamped deal, USMCA. While USMCA retained much of NAFTA's structure, it introduced significant changes. Rules of origin for cars were tightened, requiring more components to be made in North America and a higher share to be produced by workers earning at least $16 per hour. Labor and environmental provisions were strengthened and made more enforceable. Protections for digital trade were added, as well as intellectual property rules reflecting the modern economy. Dispute settlement mechanisms were adjusted, and the controversial investor-state arbitration system was scaled back. The deal was ratified with bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress, a rare moment of consensus in a polarized era. For many, USMCA demonstrated that regional trade could be reformed, made more equitable, and re-legitimized politically. It was no longer just about efficiency, it was about resilience, fairness, and sovereignty. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, a far larger and more ambitious agreement was coming to life, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCP. Signed in 2020 and implemented starting in 2022, RCEP brought together 15 countries, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all 10 members of ASEAN. Covering nearly a third of global GDP and population, it became the largest free trade area in the world. RCEP was notable for several reasons. First, it included countries with complex historical rivalries, particularly China and Japan, yet they managed to cooperate economically. Second, the agreement built upon and harmonized existing bilateral deals, reducing noodle bowl complexity in Asian trade. Third, it simplified rules of origin, allowing firms to qualify for preferential treatment with inputs from any RCEP country, a major incentive for regional supply chains. Critics pointed out that RCEP lacked the depth of other agreements. It didn't address labor rights, environmental protections, or state-owned enterprise reform in any meaningful way. But its importance was strategic. It symbolized the shift of economic gravity toward Asia and offered an alternative model to the Western liberal trade order. It also put China at the center of regional economic integration, at a time when the U.S. had stepped back from its own Pacific ambitions. That step back came in 2017, when the Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Originally envisioned as a 12-nation pact spanning the Pacific Rim, from Canada and Chile to Japan and Vietnam, TPP was designed not just to lower trade barriers, but to set 21st-century rules for labor, the environment, digital commerce, and intellectual property. It was also seen as a geopolitical counterweight to China's rising influence in Asia. After the US exit, the remaining 11 members pressed on, rebranding the agreement as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. The progressive, in the title, referred to the suspension of certain provisions, mostly US-driven rules on pharmaceuticals and investor rights, while maintaining the core of the deal. CPTPP came into force in 2018 and was quickly hailed as a landmark achievement in regional cooperation. It demonstrated that countries could move forward with ambitious trade liberalization, even in the absence of US leadership. It also opened the door to expansion. By 2023, the United Kingdom had joined CPTPP, becoming the first non-Pacific nation to do so. Other countries, including China, Taiwan, and South Korea, had applied or expressed interest, signaling the agreement's growing influence. These regional deals weren't just about economics, they were strategic tools. Countries used them to diversify trade relationships, reduce dependence on any single market, and shape the rules of the road. In a fragmented global landscape, regional agreements became the laboratories of innovation, where new models for dispute resolution, digital regulation, and green trade could be tested. But regionalism also came with risks. It threatened to erode the non-discrimination principles at the heart of the WTO, as countries outside these blocs could face higher barriers. It also created overlapping and sometimes conflicting obligations, especially for countries like Vietnam or Chile, which were part of multiple agreements with different standards. Critics warned of fragmentation, a world split into competing spheres of influence, with trade as both carrot and stick. Another challenge was enforcement. Many regional deals lacked strong mechanisms to ensure compliance. Provisions on labor rights or environmental commitments were often aspirational, without meaningful penalties. And in cases of violations, smaller countries had limited recourse against larger partners. Still, regionalism thrived. In Africa, the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, in 2021 created the largest free trade area by number of countries, aiming to boost intra-African trade, industrialization, and regional value chains. In Latin America, initiatives like the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur sought to deepen economic ties despite political headwinds. Even in Europe, where the European Union had long been the gold standard of regional integration, new trade deals with Canada, Japan, and Vietnam expanded the EU's global reach. The EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, for example, removed tariffs on 99% of traded goods and established a shared framework for sustainable development and regulatory cooperation. As climate change became an increasingly urgent issue, some regional agreements began incorporating green trade provisions. The EU, for instance, required partners to adhere to the Paris Agreement on climate as a condition for trade deals. Others explored carbon labeling, emissions-based tariffs, or support for green technology transfer. Digital trade, too, became a regional frontier. The Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA, signed by Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, aimed to build common rules for data flows, cybersecurity, e-invoicing, and AI governance. It served as a prototype for future digital chapters in broader trade agreements. In this new era, regionalism was not a retreat from globalization, but a response to its limitations. It offered a more flexible, more politically feasible path to economic integration. It allowed coalitions of the willing to push forward while the multilateral system struggled to find consensus. But the regional path is no panacea. It cannot replace the global rules that govern the broader trading system, nor can it resolve the structural tensions between advanced and developing economies or between market democracies and state-led systems. Still, regional agreements offer a path forward, imperfect, uneven, but necessary. They remind us that trade is not static, it evolves. It adapts to geopolitics, to technology, and to public sentiment. In the 21st century, regional trade agreements have become the laboratories of this evolution, crafting new norms, testing new frameworks, and attempting, however imperfectly, to reconcile the ideals of free trade with the demands of sovereignty, sustainability, and social justice. As the multilateral trading system struggled with deadlock and division in the 21st century, a new paradigm began to rise, one rooted not in universal consensus, but in regional cooperation. Regional trade agreements had existed for decades, but now they were expanding in scope, ambition, and geopolitical significance. In a world where global deals were increasingly hard to achieve, these regional pacts emerged as the engines of modern trade policy. The rationale was straightforward. Multilateral institutions like the WTO required unanimity among more than 160 countries, a Herculean task in an era of diverging interests and rising nationalism. By contrast, regional deals could be tailored to specific priorities, negotiated more rapidly, and enforced through shared institutions or bilateral diplomacy. They also allowed countries to go deeper than what multilateral rules permitted, liberalizing not just tariffs, but services, investments, labor standards, environmental rules, and digital trade. In North America, the most high-profile regional shift came in the form of the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which replaced NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA, launched in 1994, had deeply integrated the economies of the three countries, creating vast cross-border supply chains and transforming industries like automotive and agriculture. But by the 2010s, it had become politically toxic in the United States. Critics argued that NAFTA had led to job losses, factory closures, and a race to the bottom on wages and environmental standards. The Trump administration vowed to renegotiate or scrap it entirely. After months of tense talks and brinkmanship, including threats to withdraw from NAFTA, negotiators agreed in 2018 to a revamped deal, USMCA. While USMCA retained much of NAFTA's structure, it introduced significant changes. Rules of origin for cars were tightened, requiring more components to be made in North America and a higher share to be produced by workers earning at least $16 per hour. Labor and environmental provisions were strengthened and made more enforceable. Protections for digital trade were added, as well as intellectual property rules reflecting the modern economy. Dispute settlement mechanisms were adjusted, and the controversial investor-state arbitration system was scaled back. The deal was ratified with bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress, a rare moment of consensus in a polarized era. For many, USMCA demonstrated that regional trade could be reformed, made more equitable, and re-legitimized politically. It was no longer just about efficiency. It was about resilience, fairness, and sovereignty. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, a far larger and more ambitious agreement was coming to life, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. Signed in 2020 and implemented starting in 2022, RCEP brought together 15 countries, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all 10 members of ASEAN. Covering nearly a third of global GDP and population, it became the largest free trade area in the world. RCEP was notable for several reasons. First, it included countries with complex historical rivalries, particularly China and Japan, yet they managed to cooperate economically. Second, the agreement built upon and harmonized existing bilateral deals, reducing noodle bowl complexity in Asian trade. Third, it simplified rules of origin, allowing firms to qualify for preferential treatment with inputs from any RCEP country, a major incentive for regional supply chains. Critics pointed out that RCEP lacked the depth of other agreements. It didn't address labor rights, environmental protections, or state-owned enterprise reform in any meaningful way. But its importance was strategic. It symbolized the shift of economic gravity toward Asia and offered an alternative model to the Western liberal trade order. It also put China at the center of regional economic integration, at a time when the U.S. had stepped back from its own Pacific ambitions. That step back came in 2017, when the Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Originally envisioned as a 12-nation pact spanning the Pacific Rim, from Canada and Chile to Japan and Vietnam, TPP was designed not just to lower trade barriers, but to set 21st-century rules for labor, the environment, digital commerce, and intellectual property. It was also seen as a geopolitical counterweight to China's rising influence in Asia. After the U.S. exit, the remaining 11 members pressed on, rebranding the agreement as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. The progressive, in the title, referred to the suspension of certain provisions, mostly U.S. driven rules on pharmaceuticals and investor rights, while maintaining the core of the deal. CPTPP came into force in 2018 and was quickly hailed as a landmark achievement in regional cooperation. It demonstrated that countries could move forward with ambitious trade liberalization, even in the absence of U.S. leadership. It also opened the door to expansion. By 2023, the United Kingdom had joined CPTPP, becoming the first non-Pacific nation to do so. Other countries, including China, Taiwan, and South Korea, had applied or expressed interest, signaling the agreement's growing influence. These regional deals weren't just about economics, they were strategic tools. Countries used them to diversify trade relationships, reduce dependence on any single market, and shape the rules of the road. In a fragmented global landscape, regional agreements became the laboratories of innovation, where new models for dispute resolution, digital regulation, and green trade could be tested. But regionalism also came with risks. It threatened to erode the non-discrimination principles at the heart of the WTO, as countries outside these blocs could face higher barriers. It also created overlapping and sometimes conflicting obligations, especially for countries like Vietnam or Chile, which were part of multiple agreements with different standards. Critics warned of fragmentation, a world split into competing spheres of influence, with trade as both carrot and stick. Another challenge was enforcement. Many regional deals lacked strong mechanisms to ensure compliance. Provisions on labor rights or environmental commitments were often aspirational, without meaningful penalties. And in cases of violations, smaller countries had limited recourse against larger partners. Still, regionalism thrived. In Africa, the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, in 2021 created the largest free trade area by number of countries, aiming to boost intra-African trade, industrialization, and regional value chains. In Latin America, initiatives like the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur sought to deepen economic ties despite political headwinds. Even in Europe, where the European Union had long been the gold standard of regional integration, new trade deals with Canada, Japan, and Vietnam expanded the EU's global reach. The EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, for example, removed tariffs on 99% of traded goods and established a shared framework for sustainable development and regulatory cooperation. As climate change became an increasingly urgent issue, some regional agreements began incorporating green trade provisions. The EU, for instance, required partners to adhere to the Paris Agreement on climate as a condition for trade deals. Others explored carbon labeling, emissions-based tariffs, or support for green technology transfer. Digital trade, too, became a regional frontier. The Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA, signed by Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, aimed to build common rules for data flows, cybersecurity, e-invoicing, and AI governance. It served as a prototype for future digital chapters in broader trade agreements. In this new era, regionalism was not a retreat from globalization, but a response to its limitations. It offered a more flexible, more politically feasible path to economic integration. It allowed coalitions of the willing to push forward while the multilateral system struggled to find consensus. But the regional path is no panacea. It cannot replace the global rules that govern the broader trading system, nor can it resolve the structural tensions between advanced and developing economies or between market democracies and state-led systems. Still, regional agreements offer a path forward, imperfect, uneven, but necessary. They remind us that trade is not static, it evolves. It adapts to geopolitics, to technology, and to public sentiment. In the 21st century, regional trade agreements have become the laboratories of this evolution, crafting new norms, testing new frameworks, and attempting, however imperfectly, to reconcile the ideals of free trade with the demands of sovereignty, sustainability, and social justice. Global trade policy is often framed in sweeping terms: nation versus nation, liberalization versus protectionism. But on the ground, the real impacts of tariffs and trade rules are felt in specific sectors. Agriculture, automotive, and technology are three of the most emblematic industries that have not only shaped the evolution of trade policy, but have also been profoundly reshaped by it. In each of these, trade decisions ripple through supply chains, labor markets, innovation strategies, and even geopolitical alliances. Let's start with agriculture, a sector that is simultaneously the most ancient and one of the most politically sensitive areas of trade. From medieval grain tariffs to modern-day export bans and subsidies, agricultural products have always received special treatment in trade regimes. In part, this is because food security strikes at the heart of national sovereignty. But it's also because rural constituencies, while shrinking in number, hold disproportionate political influence in many countries. Nowhere is the complexity of agricultural trade policy more visible than in the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. Launched in 1962, CAP was initially designed to ensure food security and stable incomes for farmers in the aftermath of World War II. Over time, it became one of the EU's largest and most controversial budget items, consuming up to 40% of the total EU budget at various points. CAP operates through a mix of direct payments to farmers, price supports, and rural development programs. Its protectionist roots, characterized by high tariffs, quotas, and export subsidies, have long drawn criticism from outside the EU, particularly from developing countries. These critics argue that CAP distorts global markets by allowing European farmers to produce more than they otherwise would, driving down world prices and making it harder for farmers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to compete. The EU has attempted to reform CAP over the decades, shifting away from price supports and toward more environmentally targeted payments. Still, the tension between trade liberalization and agricultural protection remains. EU trade deals often become bogged down over market access for cheese, beef, wine, and other politically sensitive products. When the EU negotiates with major agricultural exporters like Mercosur or the United States, CAP policies are always on the table and frequently under fire. In contrast, the United States takes a different approach. While it maintains significant subsidies, particularly for crops like corn, soybeans, and cotton, it relies less on price supports and more on crop insurance, disaster relief, and conservation programs. The U.S. also uses trade agreements as tools to pry open foreign agricultural markets, often insisting on reduced tariffs and science-based sanitary standards for food safety. The U.S. push to expand access for genetically modified crops or hormone-treated beef is a recurring flashpoint in global trade negotiations. Agriculture is also deeply affected by non-tariff barriers, such as phytosanitary rules, labeling requirements, and origin standards. These can function like hidden tariffs, excluding foreign goods without formally violating WTO rules. And as climate policy becomes more integrated into trade frameworks, carbon footprint standards for food could become a new form of trade friction, with exporters from less regulated regions finding themselves at a competitive disadvantage. Then there is the automotive sector, one of the most globally integrated and politically fraught industries in the world. From Detroit to Stuttgart to Nagoya, car manufacturing has long been seen as a pillar of national economic strength and a prime battleground in trade negotiations. Automobiles are complex products made from thousands of parts sourced from around the world. A single car may have its engine produced in Mexico, its electronics from South Korea, its body frame stamped in Germany, and final assembly completed in the United States. This makes rules of origin, the criteria used to determine where a product is from for tariff purposes, an essential and often contested part of trade agreements. In NAFTA and later USMCA, auto rules of origin were among the most hotly negotiated chapters. The US pushed for tighter rules to ensure that a larger share of each vehicle's content came from North America and especially from American factories. USMCA introduced labor value content provisions, requiring that a percentage of each vehicle be made in facilities where workers earn at least $16 per hour. This was designed to raise wages in Mexico and reduce incentives for offshoring US jobs. Automakers have had to adjust production strategies to comply with these rules, sometimes absorbing higher costs, sometimes shifting supply lines, and sometimes lobbying for carve-outs. For consumers, the effect may be less choice or higher prices. For policymakers, the trade-off is between preserving domestic jobs and allowing companies the flexibility to optimize global production networks. The sector has also been a target for unilateral trade actions. In 2018, the Trump administration threatened tariffs on auto imports under the same national security justification used for steel. Although those tariffs were never imposed, the mere threat roiled markets and forced companies to weigh the risks of sourcing parts and vehicles from abroad. Countries like Japan and Germany scrambled to negotiate side agreements to avoid becoming collateral damage in a broader trade war. As we move into the era of electric vehicles, the automotive trade landscape is shifting again. EV supply chains depend on critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, resources that are geographically concentrated and politically sensitive. Governments are now pursuing friendshoring strategies, seeking to source these materials from allies rather than rivals. Trade agreements may soon include not just cars and parts, but also raw material sourcing requirements tied to geopolitical alliances. Finally, we turn to technology, perhaps the most dynamic and contested sector in global trade today. In the past, trade in tech was about hardware, televisions, computers, mobile phones. But now it's also about algorithms, data, and semiconductors, the very foundations of digital society and national power. In recent years, semiconductors have become the centerpiece of a strategic contest between the US, China, and their respective allies. The global chip industry is intricate. Design is dominated by American firms, manufacturing is led by Taiwan's TSMC and South Korea's Samsung, and equipment comes from Japan and the Netherlands. This complexity has made the sector vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. In 2022 and beyond, the US began imposing export controls on advanced chips and semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, citing national security and military concerns. These restrictions were coordinated with allies and aimed at slowing China's progress in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. China responded by investing billions in its domestic chip industry and restricting exports of critical materials like gallium and germanium. This tech decoupling is redrawing trade patterns. Countries are being forced to choose sides, restructure supply chains, and invest in domestic production capacity. The US passed the CHIPS and Science Act to subsidize domestic manufacturing, while the EU launched its own European Chips Act to reduce reliance on Asian suppliers. The WTO has struggled to mediate these tensions as national security exemptions are difficult to challenge. Technology trade also raises new regulatory questions. Who controls cross-border data flows? Should digital platforms be taxed where they operate or where their headquarters are located? How do you enforce intellectual property rights for AI-generated content? Countries are experimenting with different answers, some favoring open internet models, others favoring data localization and content censorship. Digital trade agreements, like DEPA and the digital chapters of CPTPP, are trying to set common standards. But as with traditional trade, the tension between openness and sovereignty looms large. In all three sectors, agriculture, automotive, and technology, trade is no longer just about comparative advantage. It's about political values, strategic dependencies, and resilience in the face of shocks. The winners and losers are not just nations, but communities, industries, and generations of workers and innovators. Understanding the sectoral impacts of tariffs and trade rules means zooming in on the details, on how policies affect planting decisions in Iowa, supply chains in Guanajuato, or chip fabs in Hsinchu. It's here, in the granular realities of production and policy, that trade ceases to be abstract and becomes deeply personal. For developing nations, trade policy is not merely a matter of economic optimization. It is a path toward transformation. Tariffs and trade rules are levers through which these countries try to lift millions out of poverty, industrialize, and assert sovereignty in a system historically built by wealthier powers. But that path is riddled with contradictions. Globalization promises access to markets and investment, yet it also exposes fragile industries to overwhelming competition. The architecture of global trade offers opportunity, but often on terms not set by the developing world. In this shifting terrain, regional cooperation has emerged as a powerful tool for many countries in the global south. Take ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Formed in 1967 during the Cold War, it began as a political alliance. But over time, it evolved into one of the most dynamic economic blocs in the world, home to over 650 million people and a combined GDP exceeding $3 trillion. At the heart of its economic integration is the ASEAN Free Trade Area, or AFTA, launched in the early 1990s. The goal of AFTA was to reduce intra-regional tariffs, harmonize customs procedures, and promote cross-border investment. And by many measures, it succeeded. By the mid-2000s, tariffs on most goods traded between ASEAN members had fallen to near zero. Countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia became integral nodes in global supply chains, attracting manufacturing from electronics to textiles. ASEAN's openness helped transform it into one of the fastest-growing regions on Earth. But this success was not automatic. ASEAN's trade policy was designed with flexibility in mind. Implementation timelines varied by country, and safeguards allowed governments to delay liberalization in sensitive sectors. The emphasis was on consensus, not coercion. This allowed smaller or less developed members like Laos and Cambodia to integrate gradually while still benefiting from the wider regional market. Still, challenges remain. Infrastructure gaps, bureaucratic delays, and non-tariff barriers continue to hinder trade within ASEAN. And while the region has courted investment from multinational corporations, many local firms struggle to move up the value chain. The risk, as always, is becoming locked into low-value roles, assembling goods for export without building domestic innovation capacity. Across the Indian Ocean, a similar project with far grander ambitions is underway. The African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA. Launched in 2021, AFCFTA represents an audacious attempt to unify a continent fragmented by colonial borders, disparate economic systems, and long-standing trade frictions. With 54 signatories and 47 countries that have ratified the agreement, AFCFTA aims to create a single market for goods and services across Africa, eventually eliminating tariffs on 90% of products and addressing barriers to trade in services, investment, and intellectual property. The long-term vision is not just about trade. It's about building Pan-African industrial capacity, enabling economies of scale, and reducing dependency on volatile commodity exports. Currently, trade between African countries is astonishingly low. Only about 15% of total trade on the continent happens intra-regionally. Most African nations export raw materials to global markets and import manufactured goods in return, reinforcing a cycle of dependency. AfCFTA seeks to change this by stimulating local production, encouraging regional value chains, and making it easier for African businesses to sell to their neighbors. But implementation is a formidable task. Many countries lack the customs infrastructure, data systems, and regulatory coherence needed to facilitate free trade. Moreover, political instability and security issues in parts of the continent complicate economic planning. Yet despite these hurdles, AfCFTA has generated immense political will and optimism. If successful, it could increase African incomes, reduce poverty, and give the continent more leverage in global trade negotiations. Then there is India, the world's most populous country and a major player in global trade politics, though one that has always marched to the beat of its own drum. For much of its post-independence history, India pursued a policy of self-reliance, with high tariffs, strict import quotas, and a deep suspicion of foreign capital. This inward-looking approach helped nurture domestic industries, but it also stifled competition and limited access to new technologies. That began to change in the 1990s, when a balance of payments crisis forced India to liberalize its economy. Tariffs were slashed, state-owned enterprises were partially privatized, and foreign investment was welcomed cautiously. India joined the WTO in 1995 and embraced the global trading system, but on its own terms. It negotiated hard, often aligning with other developing nations to resist pressure from the US and EU on issues like agricultural subsidies, intellectual property, and public health. Yet India's relationship with trade liberalization remains complex. While it has benefited immensely from globalization, especially in services, where Indian firms have become global leaders in IT and outsourcing, it has also experienced rising trade deficits, deindustrialization in certain sectors, and fierce political debates over market access. In recent years, India has taken a more protectionist turn. It raised tariffs on a wide range of imports, from electronics to chemicals. It walked away from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, at the last minute in 2019, citing concerns over a potential flood of Chinese imports and risks to its agricultural sector. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Make in India initiative aimed to boost domestic manufacturing and reduce reliance on foreign goods. India's cautious approach reflects deeper anxieties about development. Unlike many East Asian economies that used exports to fuel rapid industrialization, India's growth has been more service-led. This creates challenges in job creation, particularly for the millions of young people entering the labor market each year. Trade policy, in this context, becomes a tool not just for growth, but for social stability. For developing nations broadly, trade policy must juggle multiple and often competing priorities: export competitiveness, food and energy security, industrial upgrading, fiscal stability, and increasingly, environmental sustainability. Tariffs are used not only to protect nascent industries, but also to generate revenue in countries where tax systems remain underdeveloped. Indeed, for many low-income economies, tariffs account for a significant share of public finances, making liberalization a politically sensitive endeavor. At the same time, developing nations often face structural disadvantages in trade negotiations. They lack the technical expertise, legal capacity, or market power to push back against more advanced economies. This has led to calls for a more equitable trading system, one that recognizes the principle of special and differential treatment, allowing poorer countries longer timeframes and more flexibility in implementing trade commitments. This principle was enshrined in the WTO, but its application has been uneven. In practice, large emerging economies like China or Brazil are treated very differently than least developed countries like Chad or Haiti. Meanwhile, new issues, such as e-commerce, digital taxation, and environmental trade measures, are being shaped in forums where developing nations often have limited influence. Some countries have responded by forming coalitions, such as the G33 group advocating for food security safeguards, or the African group pushing for fairer terms in WTO negotiations. Others have turned to South-South cooperation, signing bilateral and regional trade agreements that prioritize mutual development rather than market access alone. Still, the central dilemma remains: how to engage with a global trading system that promises growth, but often delivers it unevenly. For developing nations, tariffs and trade policy are not simply technical matters. They are existential choices about the kind of economy and society they wish to build. Do they open up, integrate, and compete globally, risking local dislocation in exchange for dynamism and foreign capital? Or do they protect, regulate, and nurture domestic industries, even if it means slower growth and global friction? There is no universal answer, only context-specific strategies shaped by history, politics, and aspiration. What is clear is that the future of trade cannot be written without developing nations. They represent the majority of the world's population and the fastest-growing markets. As they assert more influence, the rules of global trade may evolve to reflect not just the priorities of the powerful, but also the needs of the many. As we look ahead, the world of tariffs and trade policy is poised for profound transformation. The centuries-old mechanisms that governed goods crossing borders, customs duties, quotas, tariffs, are now colliding with unprecedented technological advances, environmental imperatives, and new frontiers of economic activity. The future challenges of trade will test our ability to adapt not only legal frameworks, but also the very concepts of what constitutes a tradable good, who the players are, and how to balance competing interests in a deeply interconnected world. One of the most immediate and contentious challenges is the rise of digital service taxes. Unlike traditional goods, digital services, ranging from streaming media and cloud computing to online advertising and e-commerce platforms, are intangible and often delivered remotely. This creates a dilemma for governments seeking to tax the profits generated within their borders when companies may have little or no physical presence locally. For years, multinational digital giants like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple have structured their operations to minimize tax liabilities by routing profits through low-tax jurisdictions. This has sparked a backlash, particularly in Europe, where countries have introduced unilateral digital service taxes targeting revenues from digital advertising or online marketplaces. France, Italy, and the UK, among others, have been at the forefront. The United States, home to most of these tech giants, strongly opposed these taxes, arguing they unfairly discriminate against American companies. Negotiations at the OECD, involving more than 130 countries, have sought to establish a consensus on a global minimum tax and rules for allocating taxing rights, but progress has been slow and complex. Digital service taxes highlight a fundamental challenge. The old tax and trade rules were designed for physical goods moving across borders, not for bits and data flowing invisibly through fiber optic cables. Reconciling national sovereignty with the borderless nature of the digital economy requires innovative solutions, and the stakes are high. How this is resolved will shape the future of international cooperation and digital commerce. Parallel to digital taxation is the growing urgency of climate change tariffs. The global push to limit greenhouse gas emissions has spawned debates about carbon pricing through taxes, cap-and-trade systems, or regulations, and the risk of carbon leakage, where production simply shifts to countries with looser environmental standards. To address this, some countries have proposed or implemented carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAMs. These tariffs aim to level the playing field by charging imports based on their embedded carbon emissions, effectively imposing a price on carbon-intensive goods from abroad. The European Union is leading the charge with its planned carbon border adjustment mechanism, expected to start phasing in soon. It targets sectors like steel, cement, aluminium, and electricity, which are both energy-intensive and exposed to international competition. CBAMs are intended to protect domestic industries from unfair competition and incentivize cleaner production worldwide. But they also raise thorny questions. How do you accurately measure the carbon footprint of complex products made in multiple countries? Could these measures be used as disguised protectionism? How will developing nations, which may lack resources to decarbonize quickly, be affected? International trade law has not yet fully grappled with these issues, and disputes are likely. At the same time, carbon tariffs could become powerful tools in the global climate agenda, accelerating decarbonization, but also testing the limits of trade cooperation. Another fascinating frontier is the impact of 3D printing or additive manufacturing. This technology allows goods to be produced layer by layer from digital designs, often locally and on demand. In theory, this could radically reduce the need for cross-border shipping of physical products. Imagine a future where, instead of importing toys, tools, or replacement parts, consumers and businesses download a file and print them at home or in a local workshop. This would disrupt traditional manufacturing supply chains, customs procedures, and critically, tariffs. 3D printing raises a host of policy challenges. How do customs authorities enforce tariffs on digital blueprints rather than physical goods? How does intellectual property protection work when designs can be copied and shared globally? Will localized production undermine economies that rely on export manufacturing? Some analysts argue that 3D printing could lead to localization, reshoring production to be closer to consumers, thus reducing transportation emissions and supply chain vulnerabilities exposed by recent global shocks. Others caution that the technology is still limited to certain products and materials, and that mass manufacturing will remain globalized for decades. Regardless, governments will have to rethink trade rules and customs enforcement in a world where the lines between goods, services, and digital content blur. Finally, the emerging arena of space resource tariffs, once the stuff of science fiction, is edging closer to reality, with private companies and national agencies planning missions to mine asteroids, the Moon, and possibly Mars for water, minerals, and rare elements. The question arises, how will these extraterrestrial resources be governed and traded? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which forms the foundation of international space law, declares space the province of all mankind and forbids national appropriation. But it doesn't explicitly address resource extraction and ownership. Recent national laws in the US and Luxembourg recognize private rights to space-mined materials, creating a patchwork of claims. If space mining becomes commercially viable, governments and international organizations will face a host of trade-related questions. Will tariffs be imposed on materials brought back to Earth? How will ownership and profit-sharing be managed? Could space resources trigger new forms of economic competition or cooperation? The challenges of space resource tariffs are emblematic of the broader future of trade: new frontiers, ambiguous rules, and the need for innovative governance. In summary, the future of tariffs and trade policy will be shaped by the interplay of technology, environmental imperatives, and emerging economic activities. Digital service taxes challenge the traditional tax base. Carbon border adjustments integrate climate policy into trade. 3D printing threatens to blur the lines between local and global production. Space resource tariffs force us to rethink jurisdiction beyond Earth. As nations navigate these challenges, they must balance competing goals, fostering innovation and growth, protecting sovereignty, promoting sustainability, and maintaining fair competition. The lessons of history show us that trade policy is never static. It evolves in response to changing realities, interests, and technologies. What remains constant is the need for dialogue, cooperation, and a willingness to adapt. The future of tariffs is not just about economics. It is about how humanity manages the complex, interconnected systems that sustain our global civilization, and even our expansion beyond the planet itself.